Subcommittee will come to order. We're going to have early votes, so we're going to have to start. We understand minority members are on their way. The chair will recognize himself for an opening statement. Today's hearing provides us with an opportunity to examine perhaps one of the most important aspects of the 21st Century Cures Initiative. What does medical innovation or faster cures mean for patients? Keeping our work centered on the patient and understanding the patient perspective will bring much needed focus on results for patients who may lack adequate treatment options. Remember, there are only effective treatments for 500 of the 7,000 known diseases impacting patients today. While FDA has developed an enhanced structured approach to benefit risk assessment in regulatory decision-making for human drug, device, and biologic products, the committee recognizes the value of considering patients in decision-making about therapy development and access. Assessment of a drug or device's benefits and risk includes an analysis of the severity of the condition treated and the current treatment options available, and getting the patient's unique perspective should be a part of that assessment. One of our witnesses today, Pat Furlong of the Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy, PPMD, and I might say Pat is accompanied by Mary Bono Mack, a distinguished former member of this committee. Welcome, Mary. And Pat will explain how this organization was founded to create opportunities for families waiting for therapies to stop Duchenne muscular dystrophy from claiming young lives. To quote Pat Furlong, quote, patient-focused drug development acknowledges the need to gather input from patients and their caregivers to create a more complete assessment of the benefit-risk equation, encouraging predictability and increased flexibility within the review process. The clock is ticking for patients who need and deserve access to promising therapies, end quote. I would like to applaud her tireless work drafting guidance PPMD recently released that actually quantifies patient priorities and preferences. This guidance will serve the Duchenne community and every other patient community because it provides a path for other patient groups to follow. This was an enormous undertaking, and I'm confident it will make a substantial contribution to the entire medical community. I want to welcome our witnesses today and look forward to learning more about the assessment of benefits and risks central to medical product development, regulations, and healthcare decision-making, and the trade-offs between desired benefits and tolerable risk. Thank you. Any member on the majority side seeking recognition? Chair recognizes Vice Chairman Dr. Burgess for the remainder of the time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Dr. Woodcock. Thank you for joining us again. It's always good to see you. Always good to have you as a witness. You always provide valuable testimony. And our second panel of representatives also want to acknowledge, just as the chairman did, many of the patient organizations that you represent have worked well with our office and myself over the last several years. Mr. Chairman, the laudable goals of the 21st Century Cures initiatives, and they indeed are laudable, but we got to remember at the end of the day, it's all about patients. Doctors want to heal. We want to cure. That's why we entered the profession. No doctor ever wants to tell a patient there is nothing more we can do. The good news is that the golden age of medicine is really right around the corner. The doctors of tomorrow will have tools at their disposal unlike any before in human history. The ability of tomorrow's doctor to alleviate human suffering is going to be unparalleled and unmatched in history. Yet every day that goes by where these tools are not realized is a day that patients and their families have to struggle through the pain and suffering of their condition. Every day counts for these Americans and for their families. For those who struggle with rare diseases, their struggle is only compounded by the lack of biomedical research. For those patients, it's difficult to see over the horizon. We have much work to do on this committee, and we have done a lot in the past, and we particularly celebrate the 2-year anniversary of the Food and Drug Reauthorization Act that was just a few days ago. That was a good template. It was a good method for moving forward, and I appreciate that the Cures Initiative is following that template, but there is no doubt that we can do much more. I welcome the testimony of our witnesses, and I'll yield back my time.
Chair, thanks the gentleman, and now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Waxman. 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This hearing is a fitting follow-up to Wednesday's hearing on clinical trials. After all, it is patients who live with the diseases and conditions for which treatments are being sought, and this hearing, which is called 21st Century Cures Incorporating the Patient Perspective, it illustrates that we should take every opportunity to understand their experience. Congress has a long history of listening to concerns of patients. That's what I did in 1983 when I wrote the Orphan Drug Act. That law came up when I heard from a constituent, Adam Seligman, who had a rare disease called Tourette's syndrome. Adam was forced to take a drug that he could only get from Canada, because at that time there were no effective treatments available in the United States. When his drugs were seized at the border, his mother made a desperate call to my office begging me to do something. I set out to figure out why there were no drugs in the U.S. for Adam's condition. We discovered that Adam was not alone. There were 134 drugs for rare diseases, but only 10 had come to market solely as a result of industry. We knew we had a problem on our hands, and we set out to solve it. The Orphan Drug Act has been a resounding success. Today, there are over 400 drugs for rare diseases, and I want to welcome the National Organization for Rare Diseases here today and look forward to their testimony. I'm telling this story about the Orphan Drug Act not only as an example of how Congress has listened to the concerns of patients and acted on them. I tell it because it's an example of appropriate use of legislation. In the case of rare diseases in the early 80s, there was very clear evidence of a market failure in need of congressional action. In the context of the 21st Century Cures Initiative, we need to assure that both FDA and the drug and device companies are listening to the concerns of the patients. FDA has a long history of engaging with patients, both in the context of advisory committees and in its review of drugs and devices. In the 2012 FDA Safety and Innovation Act, Congress pushed FDA to do even more to hear patients' concerns, and I look forward to hearing more from FDA today. From what I can tell, the agency has taken that mandate seriously and has engaged extensively with the patient community. We should ask today whether FDA has adequate resources to continue to do this work. As I mentioned on Wednesday when we had our last hearing, when it comes to legislating in complicated scientific areas like the conduct of clinical trials, we need to proceed with great caution. For example, one issue in the area of clinical trials that's likely to come up today is how to incorporate so-called patient-reported outcomes. As I understand it, this is an area that is multifaceted and scientifically complex. Congress should ensure that FDA has the flexibility and authority to make use of these outcomes, but not dictate how and when that occurs. I hope FDA will tell us about how it is applying other novel approaches to clinical trials in their regulation of drugs and devices. I would also like to know whether the agency believes it has the authorities necessary to adopt new approaches and whether other new statutory powers are necessary. Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing. I look forward to the witnesses' testimony. I must say in advance that there's another subcommittee scheduled at the very same time as this one, so I will try to be back and forth to participate in both of them. Thank you, and yield back my time.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Now recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Upton. 5 minutes for opening statement.
I yield back my time. I'll just submit my statement in order to...
Chair, thanks to gentlemen. We have two panels today. On our first panel, we have Dr. Janet Woodcock, Director, Center for Drug Evaluation Research, U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Thank you for coming again today. You'll have 5 minutes to summarize your testimony. Your written testimony will be placed in the record. So at this time, Chair recognizes Dr. Woodcock, 5 minutes for opening statement.
Thank you. We are here to discuss how drug development better meets the needs of patients. Decades ago, healthcare was very physician-centric and actually very paternalistic. We all recognize that today. It was kind of the doctor knows best, don't ask any questions, right? Today, the model is collaboration between the patient and the healthcare team. These changes, though, have evolved slowly in our society, and the thinking in drug development has slowly changed in parallel. The FDA Safety and Innovation Act of 2 years ago took significant steps in this direction of patient-centric development. It contained agreements under PDUFA that FDA would sponsor at least 20 patient-focused, disease-focused meetings over 5 years. 8 of these meetings have been held to date, and they have been very impactful. The first one we held on chronic fatigue syndrome. We have issued a draft guidance on drug development in this area of very serious unmet medical need. Also under PDUFA were agreements to advance the development and use of patient-reported outcome measures. These are measures that the patient can fill out to say from their point of view how well they're feeling, how well the treatment is working, what adverse events they're experiencing. We are having an expert meeting next week, and we're continuing to work in collaboration consortiums to try and advance the science of patient-reported outcomes. This is very important to really scientifically incorporate the patient's perspective into clinical trials. Additionally, under FDASIA, FDA was to advance the development and use of a structured benefit risk framework in the drug approval decision. And this work is underway, and it really explicitly provides for considering the burden of disease, the impact of current therapies, both for good and for ill, and the tolerance of risk from the patient's point of view. And this is an extremely important set of factors that need to go into the benefit risk decision, but we need to do this in a scientific manner and a structured manner, and we are rolling out this structured benefit risk framework. Now, for people we know, though, for people with very serious diseases who may lack good therapy or actually lack any therapy, access to new treatments is their #1 priority. And that's why expediting drug development programs in these areas is so important. If you look at the diagram that we have here that was provided, these data and the diagram were actually developed by the pharma organization, it shows the drug development process. And starting on the left, it shows you start with many thousands of compounds, up to 10,000 compounds at one end, the beginning. And after 9 to 13 years, you may end up with one safe and effective drug on the market. The clinical development phase, which is the gray phase, the middle phase on this diagram, is the longest and by far the most expensive phase. In contrast, the FDA review phase, of which much attention has been paid to, is actually the very small slice there, the white slice toward the end of the process, right before the drug gets on the market, and is typically, at this time, less than a year in duration. So FDA has made strenuous efforts, really, to help reform and modernize the clinical development phase of drug development, because that is the major bottleneck. Not only is it expensive and long, many products fail in this phase, and there's a tremendous opportunity cost there where other treatments could have been developed. And now the FDASIA included several innovations to this process, and the most striking being the Breakthrough Therapy Designation Program. So if we could have the next diagram. Thank you. This was mandated by Congress and was specifically directed at that clinical development phase so that we could help when therapies were particularly promising and were designated, we could help move them through that phase more quickly. The BT designation has been enthusiastically subscribed. We've had over 160 requests in the 2 years since the legislation was passed. We've actually, and this is the really surprising part, we've granted 52 designations. So what Dr. Burgess said about we're on the verge of a new era in therapeutics, I think is reflected by this. We would not have seen this a decade ago. And we've approved 6 products, 4 new products and 2 new indications. Now, it's too early to judge really the impact of the breakthrough designation program. Is it really going to be able to speed up drug development? However, I will say the 4 products we approved, their clinical development time was 4.5 years. So much shorter than what I showed in the earlier diagram. Also in FDASIA were clarifications of the application of accelerated approval, and we issued a final expedited draft guidance in May that includes, in response to the stakeholders' request, examples of rare diseases and includes more information on the use in rare diseases. However, it is clear much more needs to be done to modernize the clinical trial process. That's the big bottleneck now in getting discoveries to patients. This can't be done, though, by FDA alone. We don't execute this process. All the stakeholders need to participate. And I think the series of hearings that have been held and the 21st Century Initiative can help provide the framework for significant reform in this process.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady. I will begin the questioning. Recognize myself 5 minutes for that purpose. Dr. Woodcock, what is FDA's plan to advance biomarkers and the use of patient-reported outcomes data during the drug development process and post-market setting?
And many years ago, a decade ago, we recognized that there was no structured scientific process to provide the evidentiary basis for use of a biomarker in decision making. And so doctors and biomedical researchers would float new biomarkers, but there was no rigorous process by which they could be evaluated to see if they were really useful. So we actually established a process for this. It's not really in our mission, but we established it. And it's called the biomarker qualification process. And we also worked with the European Medicines Agency and the Japanese regulators so that this would be a worldwide activity. And consortia can come into the FDA and propose a biomarker, a new biomarker, and we'll give them advice on what needs to be done. And then, and also for patient-reported outcomes. And if, in fact, that evidence is developed, then we'll publish a letter that's public, and so will the EMA if they accept it and so forth. And then any developer can use that biomarker or measure in a development program and will rely on it for the context of use. We have 79 projects by different consortia in different phases of this process right now.
Good. Describe your plans for implementation of the structured benefit risk framework. You mentioned that. Transparent to the public and to sponsors so that the assessment of data from clinical trials and other studies by FDA reviewers can be better understood and acted upon.
Yeah, well, this is an iterative process. We have had public meetings, then we went back and we're piloting this in the different drug review divisions and having the medical officers work through this framework that we've developed and see what the results are. Then when we have those results, we'll go back through a public discussion and talk about how, get input on how this can be improved. So this is not something that can happen overnight. It is a scientific process, and actually we feel that we don't have the tools right now. They exist out in society and in science, but we haven't applied them, these rigorous analytical tools, to the benefit-risk decision. And so we've had workshops on this. Various scientists come in and advise us. So we will have a public process once we have gathered more experience.
I've been hearing a lot about FDA's efforts to improve the quality of pharmaceutical manufacturing. Where do U.S. drug manufacturers currently stand when it comes to producing quality medicines? Can you tell me a little bit about your plans in this area?
Well, I think the major problem here is that many of our essential drugs are not made in the United States. and they're made all around the world, and sometimes they may only come from a single source. And this is, I think, a real vulnerability to medicine. In addition, we used to be a manufacturing powerhouse in drug manufacturing, but those jobs have moved offshore. And I think now we have an opportunity with new modern manufacturing methods, such as continuous manufacturing, to actually build a high-tech industry in the United States that actually will make the drugs we need here in this country. And FDA has been collaborating with this community, manufacturing community, to help bring this about. And we are very interested in seeing this happen.
Now, we've recently heard a lot about LungMap, the Lung Cancer Master Protocol Trial. There are other examples of similar innovative trial designs like I-SPY for breast cancer. What else needs to happen before these types of trials are no longer front-page stories?
That's a good question. We also have been advocating for this for many years, and it's wonderful to see it start to become a reality. The concept, I think, in drug development needs to be turned on its head in clinical drug development. And instead of, for each investigational drug, there's a whole clinical trial program developed with different clinical trials that take very long time, as you heard on Wednesday, to get started and so forth, that there are networks that are available that investigational drugs can be plugged into. This will provide independence of assessment, but also really decrease the time and expense of assessing whether these drugs are safe and effective. But what needs to happen, I think, is we need to expand this to more diseases. The NIH is very interested in antimicrobials and setting up a network, and other groups are looking into this. And I think you may hear today from some patient groups say cystic fibrosis has really successfully set up the infrastructure to have cystic fibrosis drugs rapidly evaluated once they reach the clinic.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady. Now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Malone, 5 minutes for questions.
I'm going to have to, since I just got here.
Okay, you want to yield to Green?
Yeah.
All right, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Woodcock, welcome back. I want to thank our chairman, our ranking member, and Dr. Woodcock for testifying. In time of revolutionary science and technological development, we have an opportunity to target specific patient populations, advance personalized medicine, and transform how we approach the prevention and treatment of disease. One of the goals I think is particularly worthy of exploration is the idea of personalized medicine, in which a patient may be able to receive more tailored drugs and treatment suited to his or her specific condition. Our understanding of human genome is a key to that goal. Academics and researchers tell me another piece is the potential for researchers and developers to discuss these drug and device innovations with patients during the development phase. Dr. Woodcock, can you give us your views on the upsides and downsides of any increasing permissibility of communication between patients and developers during the clinical trial phase of development?
It's a very interesting question. We have seen from the 1990s where only 5% of drugs were targeted. In 2013, 45% of the drugs we approved were targeted in some way. There are barriers to locating patients and joining up patients who have specific conditions, subsets, with appropriate investigational therapy. And as diseases are fragmented into smaller and smaller subsets, it's harder and harder to find these people who might be eligible for given therapy. The LungMap trial is one way of doing that, which has multiple investigational arms in one trial, so people can come in and they can be spread out. But there's great interest, of course, with more patient activism in using social media and other ways to actually match up the right patients with the right investigational drugs. And I think this is one of the challenges right now of the clinical trial enterprise.
Well, increasing patient involvement in DEA's decision-making surrounding drugs devices is a significant yet challenging endeavor. Can you provide your suggestions on how mechanisms need to be developed to accurately measure what meaningful outcomes for patients are both in the clinical outcomes and the quality of life. Can we do that?
Yes, that's what I was referring to with Chairman Pitts, is that there's a science of measurement, and patient-reported outcomes is one science. How do you measure how a patient feels from their point of view? And there are ways to do this, but these measurements have to be developed. We approve many drugs based on their impact on quality of life, so that is completely possible. But what needs to be done is this science needs to be developed, and we're participating in that. As I said, we have an expert meeting next week on patient-reported outcomes.
Well, and the patient involvement process has to be data-driven and improve the overall efficiency of drug development and maintain FDA standards of safety and effectiveness. How can Congress support the FDA in incorporating patient perspectives in regulatory decision-making in a way that helps deliver that innovative, safe, and effective medicines to the patients sooner?
Well,
Do you need statutory authority, or do you think you already have it?
to my knowledge, we have the authority to do this. And I think you will hear from the next panel, for example, how patient groups can develop draft guidance, submit it to the FDA. They can run processes that actually incorporate all their points of view and those of the expert scientists. So more of that needs to be done, but I don't know that it needs more statutory authority.
Can you do it within current resources? Because, again, you're specializing in sort of a broad brush, and I assume it costs more when you're doing individual.
Yes, well, when you have 7,000 diseases that need good treatments, and most of them don't have them, it'd be very difficult for FDA alone to develop the standards for patient-reported outcomes in each one of those diseases, much less the clinical outcomes. So much more participation of the medical and patient community is needed in drug development, and we need to find better ways to do that. But I'm not sure that it's through legislation.
Okay. Okay. And without doubt, our greater resources, but again, our committee has worked over the years to try and provide those resources to the FDA, and look forward to working with you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I recognize myself 5 minutes for the purposes of questions. And Dr. Woodcock, again, good to see you. Good to have you back in the committee. So you've talked about how the FDA routinely works with sponsors to apply flexibility, including the use of biomarkers, surrogate endpoints, and non-traditional trial designs, and other available tools to expedite the development of products to treat both common and rare diseases. With respect to the common diseases, how is the FDA working with sponsors to apply these innovative development and review methods?
Well, for example, hypertension is a common disease. We approve drugs for hypertension based on a surrogate measure, blood pressure, that's very well accepted. And for a number of years ago, we looked at automated blood pressure monitoring, okay, and we decided it was unbiased. And so we decided that you really didn't need a control group in the same way that you would for most other diseases, because you have an unbiased measure. And so we issued new approaches to studying antihypertensive medicines. So that's an example.
What could happen so that the FDA could use this more frequently?
Well, 45% of the drugs that we approved over the last several years used a surrogate endpoint. So we do use that when it's appropriate and it is available. For many diseases, we don't know what the right surrogate is, and that's why many of the accelerated approvals have been confined, say, to cancer and HIV, is because the science, a great deal of science has been driven in those conditions, and we understand the biomarkers. But for other diseases, there needs to be more scientific development, and that's why we're using this, for example, biomarker qualification process to try and get more biomarkers developed that we can use. But we can't just dream them up and use them.
I thought that was your job. Well, let me ask you this. Are there situations where a majority of the scientific or research community believes that a certain biomarker sufficiently predicts a clinical outcome, but the FDA has yet to accept that?
There may be. I think there's a lot of controversy around use of these. You heard some of that on Wednesday. There are two sides to this. If you rely upon a surrogate, often, especially when it isn't well validated, there's more uncertainty about whether or not the drug is actually going to work or not. And so there are different points of view. And as we've all been saying, the community, the patient community really ought to have, and treating community ought to have a lot of input into how much uncertainty should be tolerated given the circumstances of that disease. So there are situations where there's disagreement amongst various parties, external and internal, about the use of a surrogate.
Are there any? Are you able to give us any examples of that, of a surrogate that the FDA may not right now be willing to accept?
Well, for example, raising good cholesterol. All right, we had a series of trials on that. Everybody thought raising good cholesterol would be really good, and in fact, it turned out to be either neutral, or in one case, it actually increased mortality. So we no longer accept that surrogate. That's the kind of example where, and there are many others like that in bone density, for osteoporosis. Estrogens do a very good job, and they decrease fractures, although they have other liabilities. But some other agents were tried, and actually they increase bone density, but they also increase fractures. And so we have to be careful when we use these surrogates to make sure that we're getting the intended result, the clinical result.
Thank you for that. Let me ask you a question as a follow-up from when we visited in April. Do you have an update on the status of the FDA's guidance on biosimilars naming and when the guidance will become final?
Well, I certainly would like to get that guidance out as soon as possible. We are working diligently on that, and I don't have any further update.
But that was submitted as a question in April, and we are awaiting an answer. Now, also, along with that, I asked if anyone in the administration outside of the FDA had provided the agency with suggestions or recommendations with respect to this guidance. Can you, if the answer to that is yes, can you provide us with the name or names of those individuals?
We would have to get back to you on that.
And again, we anxiously await your answer. My time has expired. I'll recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, the ranking member. 5 minutes is for questions.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, you asked a lot of my questions, so I'm going to have to move on to other things. But Dr. Woodcock, we heard a lot at Wednesday's hearing about the accelerated approval program at FDA, and as you know, the program allows for earlier approval of drugs that treat serious conditions and fill an unmet medical need, and the drugs are approved on the basis of surrogate endpoints, which we also learned about on Wednesday. And of course, a critical requirement of the system is that companies conduct studies to confirm the clinical benefits suggested by the surrogate endpoint, and these studies are called Phase 4 confirmatory trials. So a critical part, I wanted to ask about the Phase 4 trials. What challenges has FDA faced with respect to Phase 4 trials? Do sponsors complete them in a timely manner?
Well, it is sometimes difficult to complete these trials, and the reason is that if you had a serious and life-threatening disease and we approved a treatment for it, you probably would be somewhat reluctant to enter a trial where you had a maybe 50% chance of not getting the treatment. So what we often do is ask the trials be conducted in a different stage of disease or something where it actually hasn't been studied yet, so then we can get the results, and that might take time. So I think in the early years of the program, we didn't track this as well as we should, and we did have a lot of trouble getting these trials completed. But in the current era, we are on top of this, and generally speaking, the sponsors are diligent in trying to get them completed, generally, but they have difficulties sometimes enrolling patients in these trials.
Another important component of the program is that when the surrogate endpoints do not ultimately show the anticipated clinical benefit, FDA could be faced with needing to remove the indication or take the drug off the market. And I imagine that's also no easy task. Can you describe what's involved with removing the indication or taking a drug off the market, and what challenges does the FDA face there?
Yeah, generally, if the confirmatory trial failed to show benefit, the first thing we ask is the sponsor to voluntarily withdraw the drug or the indication from the market. It's only if the sponsor does not agree to do that, then we go into a long administrative process, which includes hearings and findings, formal findings, and so forth. And this can take a long time if the sponsor contests our finding that the drug isn't effective.
Now, just a couple of years ago, we included some provisions to improve upon the Accelerated Approval Program in the FDA Safety and Innovation Act of 2012. For example, the law made it clear that FDA could rely upon evidence developed using biomarkers or other scientific methods or tools when assessing surrogate endpoints. Can you describe what impact those legislative changes had on the program, and are there any other changes that you feel are necessary to allow you to make full use of the most recent scientific developments with respect to surrogate endpoints?
I think the legislation was very helpful. We've taken it quite seriously. We have issued guidance, final guidance on expedited programs, and probably the biggest change in that the legislation brought about was its focus on intermediate clinical endpoints. And we had to have quite an internal discussion about what that means. And I think you will see us approving more products under accelerated approval based on these intermediate clinical endpoints.
All right. Well, thanks. It's clear to me that this is an extremely complicated area and one that's not necessarily conducive to further legislation. But I wanted to ask last about the master protocol. At the hearing on Wednesday, some panelists described some of the inefficiencies that exist in the way that clinical trials are currently conducted. And one of the suggestions for addressing those inefficiencies is to create a master protocol. So I just wanted to ask, first, can you tell us more about this? What's a master protocol? How would it help to improve the way we conduct clinical trials? Has FDA been involved in the development of a master protocol? And are there particular diseases that the master protocol is more appropriate for than others? And if so, which ones? And are there other areas where it might be expanded?
Well, master protocol is one version of using clinical trial networks or standing clinical trials to evaluate investigational therapies, where the drug development program isn't just for one therapy, it's for any therapy for that disease. So master protocol, though, has to be somewhat disease specific. You can't just have a general overall master protocol, right? It has to be focused on one disease. For example, the lung map trial is on squamous cell cancer of the lung that is advanced. And, but 5 different agents right now are being studied all at once within that protocol, and that's a huge efficiency. But there are other versions of standing trials or trial networks that also could be used in other diseases. And as I said, the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation has a kind of network of clinical excellence where they've actually sequenced the genome of all their patients. And so they're ready when a targeted therapy comes along. They're ready. They can put those patients into the protocol, and that tremendously improves the efficiency. So it's a long conversation that probably can't be had in 5 minutes, but I have long advanced this concept and tried to push this concept because the current clinical trial paradigm is not sustainable.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania. Dr. Murphy, 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you, and good morning, doctor. It's always good to have you here. Let me start off by asking about it is important for the medications in research to advance those, but also for those that are already approved. And so let me ask you: we had passed the GDUFA laws a while ago. Certainly, Mr. Griffith, you just moved between me. Thank you. That helped. It was supposed to help us get more generic drugs in the queue. But what's happened is we've got $1.5 billion authorized over 5 years. But what's happened is approval times have gone up, and there are fewer approvals, even though the law was supposed to reduce all those. Can you give me some indication of what's going on and what FDA is going to do about that?
Certainly. We're well aware of these issues. In June, we received 625, I believe, generic drug applications. So it's the rate of submission is well above what was projected in the negotiations that we held. However, on October 1, the deadlines kick in for submission, for timelines for review of generic drugs, and we are fully prepared to meet those timelines, as well as deal with this large backlog of pending. We had to hire a large number of people and totally revise our processes, reorganize the generic drug review offices, and conduct many other changes. And that's what we have done over the past 2 years in preparation for the deadlines coming into effect on October 1.
Thank you. Another question here about some labeling issues. The abbreviated new drug application that would allow generic manufacturers, this is a proposal for FDA, to change the label without FDA's prior approval, but then come back later on. And as the FDA itself has recognized, let me say, quote, consistent labeling will assure physicians, health professionals, and consumers that a generic drug is as safe and effective as its brand name counterpart, unquote. But there's a concern out there that allowing these changes to take place and then go backfill them later on can cause a lot of confusion. And in studies that have asked pharmacists and physicians this, and I'm wondering where this issue stands in clarifying this.
Well, we have received comments on the proposed rule. It was a proposed rule, and we've received many comments. We're analyzing the comments, and subsequent to that, we will have to go forward with a rulemaking process. The proposed rule contemplated that we would actually have less disparities of labels in the marketplace on this because of this proposal, because we would put up a website and we would also require conformance of labels, which we cannot carry through right now given the current systems.
But the committee, we have a letter here back in January asked to meet with Commissioner Hamburg and others about this, and I'm not sure those things have taken place yet. So I hope this gets expedited and that these issues are addressed, because I think it still leaves some confusion. So I'm not clear yet in understanding even why this proposed rule was set up there to allow this individuals to change the label and then come back later and ask permission.
Well, currently, generic labels do not always match the innovator, and they do not change their label in a timely manner. And so there will be labels out there for quite a bit of time, even with serious safety issues like new box warnings that don't conform to the innovator label. So we are trying to address this situation, and also as generics are now 85% of all drugs dispensed to consumers, that they should have the opportunity, since their drugs are the ones that people are being exposed to submit their findings of adverse events and suggest label changes, propose label changes, and actually execute them.
Well, I just hope that you'll meet with committee staff members and companies to help clarify this, because it still is not clear to me why this would be allowed, and I think it would end up being confusing. I want to bring up one last thing just while you're here. I had sent a letter a few weeks ago to Dr. Hamburg. I'm sure you didn't see this, but one of the things that's out there, too, is complications that are oftentimes reported in the media about caffeine, whether it's and sometimes toxic levels people take through over-the-counter things, or pure caffeine, or so many supplements out there for athletes, et cetera. And yet it's also in everything from chocolate to coffee and other things that we promote all the time. So I'm hoping at some point FDA can also give some recommendations in terms of individual levels per drink, per dose, per day, for male, female, genders, for weight, age, whatever that is. Because it's still pretty confusing whatever those products are, that they can be beneficial. But I hope you'll expedite that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back.
No, his time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Capps, for 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you for holding this hearing. To our chairman and ranking member, thank you, Dr. Woodcock, for your testimony. This is an issue very dear to me. And as you know, I'm incredibly concerned by our nation's history of excluding minority groups, especially women, from all levels of medical research, from the lab rats to the most advanced clinical trials. And reports have shown that even when these groups are included in trials, there are often too few participants in the groups to analyze the effects on them, or the analysis are simply not run or reported. I'm sure you're familiar with the case of Ambien, commonly prescribed medication that recently had its label changed because it metabolizes differently in women than men, meaning that women had been receiving an inappropriately high dose of this drug for over 20 years. In addition, this spring, a report entitled Sex-Specific Medical Research, Why Women's Health Can't Wait, was released, which provides evidence for the further inclusion of sex and gender in scientific research. And the FDA's own August 2013 report, which was initiated by the inclusion of My Heart for Women Act in the FDASIA legislation, showed that there is still much work to be done to make sure that women are fully represented in clinical trials and that the safety and effectiveness of information is readily available. I know the FDA is continuing to work on an action plan to address these disparities. So, Dr. Woodcock, can you give us an update on where the agency is on this?
Certainly, I would expect that that would be released. We would be timely in its release. I believe there was a statutory deadline on that, or there was some expectation. So we're working diligently on the action plan. Yes, but I will say for drug development, which was what I'm discussing here, that we did a study, for example, in 2010, the class of 2010, the products that we approved. We found that 45%, more than 45%, about 45% of the participants were male. All right. So, and we found that almost all the submissions included the required gender analysis, which has been required for drugs for 20 years. Because I oversaw that when I first joined the Center for Drugs in 1994. So just by regulation. So we do have these, but I think the transparency of the information is the problem. Right. And we are working on that. And I really am committed to making that information more transparent so people understand what we know and what we don't know.
I think I think you put your finger on something, and I want to highlight a bipartisan letter I led, signed by the women of the House of Representatives, urging this agency to plan to include clear and actionable strategies. And I think what you said about transparency and the reporting in the action plan is a way to address this issue once and for all. At Wednesday's hearing this week, I also asked the panel about the tools FDA is developing that could supplement our knowledge base, especially in the light of less robust clinical trial designs. The FDA's Sentinel system, which I understand is making progress, if slowly, to conduct post-market passive surveillance of drugs and devices, could help spot issues like adverse drug interactions more quickly. I believe the Sentinel program holds great promise, and that's why I work to get assurance, the Sentinel Insurance for Effective Devices Act included in FDASIA to continue progress on the program and ensure that it will be designed for both drugs and devices. Could you update us on the development of the Sentinel program, please? And what other resources or authorities do you need to get the system up and running to protect consumers more effectively and expeditiously?
Well, I think use of electronic health data, which is rapidly becoming available, and the electronic health records and so forth, has tremendous promise for actually finding out what happens in the real world for medical products, both that are approved recently and those that have been on the market a long time. And that's what the Sentinel system is intended to do. We have run the mini Sentinel network for 5 years, and that was between drugs and biologics. We paid for that out of our money that we have. We are recompeting that to put up the Sentinel system. So that contract proposal is out on the street, and we hope to establish the real Sentinel system, which will be a large-scale system for surveillance. Now, as far as medical devices, we require a unique identifier or some kind of identifier in the medical record electronically so that we're able to capture that, because the Sentinel system uses those electronic records to get the information. And I will repeat for everyone that it does not take any personal information and move it to some central database. It strictly runs those analyses within the healthcare systems, and then the results only are combined. So that has tremendous promise. We feel very good about that. We actually are piloting running active surveillance on there. So when we approve a drug and we have a question about it, we can watch over time and see what actually happens. So it has, and as the more and more people get on electronic health records, we can really have more insight in what's happening. So that's where we are with that. And it is resource limited. I have to pull resources from other activities to fund that, but I believe very strongly that this is the future.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady. Now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Dr. Gingrey. 5 minutes for questions.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Dr. Woodcock, thank you for appearing. It's always good to see you. I understand that a number of the challenges that have led to the duration and cost of conducting clinical trials in the U.S. to increase essentially are outside of FDA's purview. That being said, clinical trials are conducted to generate evidence used in the application for FDA approval. So how early, my first question, how early do you typically communicate with these companies, pharmaceutical companies, to discuss their trial design before the investigational new drug application is submitted?
Well, we have agreements under PDUFA, the Prescription Drug User Fee Program, and for novel products or novel indications, say they're testing in a disease that really doesn't have any treatment, companies can come in and have a pre-IND meeting. That meeting is before they start their clinical trials, their first-in-human studies, and we talk about that development program so they can start thinking about how that's going to be done. We do have information, it's preliminary, but looking at our information, it seems that companies that have more interactions with the FDA are able to get their products through more quickly through the entire clinical trial process than companies that haven't had interaction with the FDA during the development process. But there are formal meetings that are held at different times under the user fee program, and those minutes are tracked, and we track the meetings and so forth. So there's quite a process for interaction during drug development.
So you as a manager, it would be maybe at that particular time that you make sure that your reviewers are not requesting overly burdensome data that really is not necessary, so that the process can be speeded up.
Well, there's always a push and pull. You know, scientists of all stripes always want more data, and that's scientists in the companies and scientists in the FDA. And so we have to walk that path between, you know, getting more data and actually the cost that's generated. And we've made a number of efforts under the city collaboration that we do with Duke University and many, many, many other partners to try and figure out how to streamline clinical trials as far as data collection, for example. But it's difficult. We have 1,600 meetings a year under the PDUFA. And when we meet with companies, the supervisors are there. The senior medical officials are also at these meetings.
Well, that's the whole purpose of 21st Century Cures, of course. And as we get to the second panel and we hear about the associations and from the families, I'm sure they're going to talk about how we can speed this process up. The last question. At our first 21st Century Cures hearing, we heard that only 19 drugs outside of cancer and HIV space have been approved by the accelerated approval pathway since 1992. And I understand that you wrote a blog post after that hearing how a number of drugs that were being considered under accelerated approval ultimately received traditional approval. So these statistics, according to your blog, were somewhat misleading. Can you provide some examples of when that occurred as well as the process involved?
Certainly. Well, for certain rare diseases, we may decide, for example, that the surrogate is fine, okay, and it correlates with clinical benefit. Then the term accelerated approval is a little misleading. It sounds like it's faster than regular approval. But actually, if we give regular approval on a surrogate, it's just as fast as accelerated approval, but you don't have to do confirmatory studies afterward because we already believe the surrogate. So for a lot of, say, rare deficiency diseases, okay, where there's something missing, you may be able to show that you actually, when you replace that protein in the body, you give the activity back to the person, right? And so you may not have to show clinical outcomes. That's still a surrogate, but we feel it's good enough because we understand the problem, that something is missing. And you deliver an active drug to the site of action of where the problem is, and that would be enough. So in many cases, we're able to do traditional approval with a surrogate. That means that the patients and the sponsor don't have to go through all these confirmatory trials. I described the difficulties of that when you have a serious disease, you've approved a drug, and then you ask people to be randomized after approval.
Dr. Woodcock, thank you. My time's expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. And I
Chair,
yield
thanks,
back.
gentlemen. Now I recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, 5 minutes for questions.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Woodcock, for everything you're doing to ensure safe and effective drugs are available for the American public and those with health challenges. This is a hearing about the patient involvement in FDA drug approvals, and I think we can agree they deserve a seat at the table when companies are developing drugs and medical devices within the clinical trial process. I have long been a supporter of the Department of Defense's congressionally directed medical research programs, known as the CDMRP. CDMRP funds peer-reviewed research into breast cancer, autism, ovarian cancer, prostate cancer, and other diseases. And since 1993, the patients have been involved and have been a part of CDMRP. And they have a consumer reviewer as part of a peer review panel to represent the stakeholder community. And it's been very successful in combining patient perspectives and needs with scientific research and bringing those perspectives together. Has FDA, as you begin to consider improving patient involvement, have you looked at CDRMP to see if there's anything you can borrow from that in the drug approval process?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have not, and that's a good suggestion. So we'd be happy to do that.
Okay. You mentioned previously that the patient-focused drug development initiative that was included in PDUFA was designed to allow FDA to hear from patients on how a disease impacts their life. And I understand you're scheduled to hold 20 public hearings. Share with us who FDA has met with so far. Have you started those hearings? And if so, what have you learned already?
Well, we've learned the devastating impact, I think, of the diseases, of these different diseases on people's lives is just incredible. We've had one on chronic fatigue syndrome. That was our first one. HIV, lung cancer, narcolepsy, sickle cell disease, fibromyalgia, pulmonary arterial hypertension, and inborn errors of metabolism. And we plan to have 16 of these meetings completed by the end of 2015. But we recognize this is just a drop in the bucket of what people suffer from. So what we're trying to do is really model how people can do this, and hopefully it could be done more, not put on by the FDA, but by the patient groups themselves and the medical community that serves them, so that they can assemble more of this information and kind of multiply the effect of this. And we're already seeing some of that. NORD, for example, is offered to help with rare diseases, for example, to have more input that way, because our resources are limited. We're not going to be able to cover all the different diseases.
Good. So I expect we'll hear from the patient organizations later today on and their view on how they can be helpful and we can be effective. I think the wave of the future really is the information we'll be able to gather through the electronic health record. So it's interesting to hear what you've done already with the Sentinel initiative. I've heard from research institutes back home that are doing so much in genomics and personalized medicine that they think these larger networks are the wave of the future. You say you don't need additional legislation to continue, but you're having to borrow resources from this and that. Mm-hmm. So is your advice to the committee that we need to do more in technology when it comes to improving timelines on clinical trials by focusing on these networks and the electronic health record?
The networks also have much, the electronic networks have much promise in doing clinical trials. If we could move clinical trials more out into the community and have people out in the community, like cancer patients, most cancer patients in the U.S. who have diseases that are untreatable don't get into trials because they're being treated at places that aren't running trials. So we need to move this out into the community, make those folks eligible. And I'm on the steering committee of the lung map trial, and I've really urged that we make sure that we're out there in the community so that anyone who has lung cancer has an opportunity to participate in this research and perhaps have a more effective therapy. So I think the electronic health records, that's a huge different area that we're working on, and how to do clinical trials utilizing that infrastructure is emerging.
Great, thank you very much.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. I recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Lance, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. A portion of your testimony has focused on FDA's efforts on patient engagement. It is my understanding that clinicaltrials.gov was intended to be a resource that provides clinical study information for patients, for healthcare providers, and for researchers. But it seems to me that the site lacks considerable information and has proven to be difficult to navigate. Dr. Woodcock, would you please comment on the current utility of clinicaltrials.gov?
Well, I think that it has provided, along with the requirement of the medical editors of the journals, that things be registered before they're going to be published, provided tremendously more transparency into what clinical trials are ongoing in the United States, and that's been a big achievement. All right, so we know, the issue of publication bias and everything is minimized because we know what trials have been done. However, I agree that certainly for patients, I think that initiation of trials and understanding where there might be a trial that might be ongoing, that might be available to them, has also been effective, although, as you said, there are technological issues that remain. So it has made tremendous progress in transparency.
Is there a way that you and we can work together to improve it? And I'm not suggesting that you are in any way responsible for the challenges that remain, but moving forward for the better health of the American people, how together can we improve it?
Well, the FDA Amendment Act required that regulations be issued around the results section of this, and that they consider whether to require the submission of clinical trial results for unapproved products, because much of the lag in getting results in there is that the products still are not on the market. So NIH is the lead for this rulemaking. I think they'd be in the best position, and also they operate the infrastructure for this database.
Thank you. In another area, in the past several hearings, we have discussed the difficulty of various institutions communicating one with another, and a lack of coordination often leads to inefficiencies. What methods are currently in place to reduce redundancies in clinical trials, and what steps can we take together to ensure that we're not doubling up on research or making the same mistakes over and over?
Hopefully, most things would eventually come out and be published, but certainly in the drug development area, there's interest in more sharing of earlier data and sharing of failures. But this has proven to be a very intractable area for transparency.
Yes.
All right, but we continue to work on that.
Yes.
As far as some of the things that were referred to in the prior hearing, which I was able to listen to some of, they were talking about some of the inefficiencies, say, of IRBs, where multiple IRBs, they might have to have 100 IRBs that look at, and I believe that there are efforts to try and address this. It's not an FDA issue, but really we came out a number of years ago in saying that central IRBs would really be preferable in these large multi-center trials. And then the contractual agreements that take so long to set up with each specific site is something that has been taken on. They've tried to develop model agreements and so forth, but that's something that the standing trial addresses, because you sign this contractual agreement once, and then you can do multiple investigational agents.
Are we moving in the direction of central IRBs in your judgment?
Yes. I mean, there's certainly a consensus, I think, in the clinical trial investigator community that this is desirable, but various universities naturally are concerned, legally concerned about their own
Of course.
liabilities and so forth, and so there's a push and pull about
I
that.
think this is an area that we should engage in further investigation to make sure that we move forward in a manner that does not result in redundancies. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my
Chair,
time.
thanks, gentlemen. Now recognize the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Woodcock. I think you're really an excellent witness. I appreciate your answers. I wanted to go a little bit further on the problem that Congresswoman Capps raised about the underrepresentation of women. I know you said that you found that actually women were overrepresented, but recently the Congressional Caucus for Women's Issues sponsored a meeting with leading women heart experts, both clinical and research experts, physicians. Those experts raised concern that the lack of representation from women in clinical trials is limiting our ability to effectively treat women with heart disease. They were focusing in on heart disease. And according to those experts, for the last 50 years, women's heart treatment has largely been based on medical research about men. And even today, despite that fact, what they said is that though women make up more than 50% of the U.S. population, that women comprise only 24% of participants in all heart-related studies. And additionally, scientists from the Women Health Research Institute at Northwestern, that's in my district, have raised concerns about the disproportionate number of adverse drug effects that occur in women due to the lack of sex-based clinical research. And as you know, the biological, physiological, hormonal differences in males and females impact the rate of drug absorption, distribution, metabolism, elimination, and ultimately affect the drug's effectiveness. According to those experts, the lack of requirement for drug manufacturers to take this into account and document any sex variability early in the drug development pipeline before a drug has been released places consumers, especially female patients, at increased risk of adverse drug effects. So I want you to respond to that.
Certainly.
Many of us were really left with a very disturbing feeling because heart disease is the major killer of women right now.
Well, I think we have to, what are the facts on the ground, all right? One of the reasons for the disparities that they're mentioning is actually the fact that men suffer heart disease earlier in life than women.
Although, let me just point out, they also said that the growing number, even though it's lower,
Yes.
is younger women getting heart attacks and heart disease.
Yes. So that the reason for maybe maldistribution in the trials is because there's an age cutoff, and there always has been. In our survey, we found that there were 19% of the people in the trial in these 147 studies we looked at were over 65, which is more than in the general population, obviously, but it is of sick people, that's still low representation, right, say of people with heart disease. Generally speaking, there's often a cutoff, age 75, and we're trying to eliminate those cutoffs for age and concomitant conditions so that the population will be more representative. But to your original point, we've always required male and female animals in the toxicology studies, all right? We require what we call population PD, pharmacokinetics, PK, PD, early in drug development, and we look at our clinical pharmacologists look at blood levels and exposure in men and women, and we understand that usually that's modern drug development. So there are multiple trials that are done that look at exposures, in other words, achieved blood level by gender and other factors, liver failure, kidney failure, and so forth. And we can look at the phase 3 trials to see if there has been a requirement in the regulations since, I think, 1994 that sponsors submit a gender analysis with their application.
Well, is this incorrect then? It says women comprise only 24% of participants in all heart-related studies.
Well, that may be true, and that may also include medical devices. It also may have to do with this age disparity when onset of disease.
I really hope that you'll look at that, because it's a great concern. It's a growing problem for women. Let me just give you an example of what she said. Women, because we have different symptoms of heart disease, she says if you have some of these symptoms of nausea, dizziness, go to the emergency room, but say, I'm having chest pains, because without that, you may not get an electrocardiogram, and you may be misdiagnosed. We need to help women. Thank you. I yield.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. Now recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Dr. Cassidy, 5 minutes for question.
Thank you. Okay.
I mean, that's a big compliment. So next, real quickly, because I want to talk about something else, but does FDA, you mentioned that some institutions may be nervous about their liability if they refer their IRB activity to a centralized IRB.
Correct.
Except so many do. We know that's a false argument. Is there any way FDA can reassure those institutions? Because the gentleman from Mayo suggested it's a cultural issue. He didn't mention anything about legal. Thoughts?
Right. Yes. Well, I heard his testimony. I think that in my experience, that there are concerns of the council of the various.
Attorneys are always nervous, right? I mean, they don't make money if they're not nervous. I hate to be cynical, but
yes.
Is there any way you can FDA can send reassurances regarding that?
Well, we have tried in guidance and so forth. We have encouraged this, and in the city initiative, we had a whole discussion and dissemination of information about central IRBs. But possibly there's more that we can do to encourage this.
Okay. Let me then go back to, you mentioned something intriguing earlier, that there may be some at high risk for disease, so therefore they will be more risk tolerant.
Yeah.
Now, I have a family member, a nephew with Down syndrome, and I'm looking on the Alzheimer's.org website, and they mention how virtually 100% of adults with Down syndrome by age 40 will have evidence of the tangles associated with Alzheimer's. Mm-hmm. Now, what are the issues regarding, wow, this is a group of kids who are adults who at risk, 100% at risk for a terrible condition.
Right.
But there's other issues involved as well. What are your thoughts about this? How do we make stuff available for folks incredibly at risk for such a terrible disease?
Yes. Well, with Alzheimer's, there are a number of problems. The basic problem is we still don't understand the disease well enough, and the interventions that have been tried, which have been in late-stage disease, when people are already demented, have failed to work.
Now, as I gather, though, the problem is predicting at an earlier stage those at risk, correct?
That's correct. If you want to intervene early. We recently issued a draft guidance saying that, okay, if you want to intervene earlier, we would accept an endpoint that is subtle cognitive testing.
I accept that, but how do you decide which population is at such high risk? Because if you have a control group,
That's right.
you follow what I'm saying, only 10% are really going to be at risk.
Right.
You with me? This is a really expensive study.
That's right. And so we advocate techniques called enrichment, which you try to use biomarkers or other tests to figure out there are genetic conditions that increase your risk for Alzheimer's disease.
So speaking of Down syndrome as one example.
That would be one example. Yeah, there are others.
And can you give us the progress of that? So if you accept these, are people now using these?
Well, we need agents to use them in. So that's
I'm sorry, agents. You mean as
I'm sorry, investigational interventions that we can test in the people. And that's part of the problem, the science of understanding what causes Alzheimer's and what you can intervene in that would actually delay or prevent the disease is not mature enough. And we don't have really, we've approved a couple imaging agents for Alzheimer's, but they aren't 100%. And you would maybe be kind of.
But for example, I know hyperinsulinemia is thought to be a potential risk factor. Mm-hmm. And I think there are some studies suggesting that Actos might give some benefit. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Presumably it would be at an earlier stage, not a later stage. Mm-hmm. It would be a non-metabolic syndrome indication for the use of Actos. Fair statement? Mm-hmm. Now, so there's at least some of that. I guess I pose that to ask to the degree to which that has been, again, the current state. I'll go back to what is the current state of using that sort of thing.
Right. So the current state, we would, if someone decided to do a trial, and I believe there have been some intervention trials, not at Actos, but an earlier intervention at high risk and higher risk people, they might identify people they felt were at high risk for one reason or another, randomize them to this intervention or not, and then we would allow use of neurocognitive testing even before they had symptoms, if they had subtle changes. And if the treatment group did better than the placebo group, we could give accelerated approval.
So you are, I guess you've got a framework. It's just a question of someone coming forward to take advantage of it. But how long would such a study, do you imagine, take to complete its course? 20 years?
No, but that we need to have better measurements. Let's get to these biomarkers and other measurements, like of subtle cognitive function, where we're, the NIH and us and others are working on this, because the earlier you can intervene, if you have a very targeted test that can identify people early, they don't have any symptoms, but you can tell their brain isn't working as well as it should, and then it'll decrease over time. So that's kind of the rate limiting step. But I agree, prevention is very difficult, because there you want to intervene on people who are well and treat them for a long time and expose them to something with the hope that at the end of the day they're not going to get whatever bad outcome.
Well, we're out of time. Thank you very much.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Gifforth, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Woodcock, as others have said today, and also what I have heard in some of our informal conversations, is that you not only do a good job as a witness, but that you're doing a good job overall. And so I appreciate that, and thank you so much for being here today. I will tell you, you and Dr. Cassidy had a little conversation about lawyers, and some lawyers are always nervous, other lawyers are always looking for a way to find a way to solve the problem. And so maybe we need to get some of those lawyers on your team and some of the corporate teams to solve the problem, figure out how we can make these things work, because I do think it's important. As you probably know, I'm one of those who advocates that we try to move a little quicker in those areas where we have problems that we don't have solutions for currently, and also favor what is known in some states, the state laws, is right to try when you have a situation where doctors have tried everything and folks are given a diagnosis they've got months to live, or their condition is going to be fatal. I'm one of those people who believes that we ought to let them go ahead and try whatever it is they're willing to pay to do, because the FDA can't protect you if you're going to die from something that might kill you. Right. I mean, it's going to happen one way or the other. You might as well have the right to try something. That being said, I know there are a lot of issues surrounding that. I'm not sure we have time for that today, for that discussion today, and I know that there's another panel, and I want to hear from the patients as well, because they're involved in this process. So respecting you greatly, I yield back my time.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen, and recognize the gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Elmers. 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Woodcock, for being with us again today. This is such an important issue. As you know, we had our panel on Wednesday, and it seemed to me that it was a general consensus that everyone is looking for ways, to expedite this and to make it more efficient and get those drugs to market sooner, so that we can be taking care of our patients more effectively. In your testimony and in the discussions that we've had today, you've touched on the biomarkers and targeted drug development to benefit disease populations, obviously. As all of our representatives here, we all have constituents with rare diseases, heartbreaking. Yeah. Especially right now in my community, we have, I have a very good friend with ALS. And as I'm learning more and realizing we've had a number of our members of our community diagnosed with ALS. So this is something that is very important to me right now. And I'm just looking at the idea as far as the target approval process being appropriated and applied through the FDA. It seems to be that we're looking at cancer and HIV. Where do some of those rare diseases fall within that? And you had mentioned, and there was discussion about the master protocol. and that seems to be applied more to cancer, HIV. Where can some of the rare diseases fall in there, and what can we do to help make that happen?
Well, any rare disease would be a great candidate for a standing network, a network of experts, and I think you may hear more about this from the next panel, where they're ready to evaluate any therapy that advances through the non-human stages, so they can pick that up right away and test it quickly. And in the meantime, until that happens, they can get what we call natural history, which I know sounds very wonky, but people were asking just now, Mr. Cassidy, like, how long does Alzheimer's progress from pre-symptomatic to symptomatic? Well, we need to know that so we can design the trial correctly. In rare diseases, even more difficult, because nobody knows. And usually they get experts together and say, well, in my opinion, it takes this long, right? And they're usually wrong because they've only seen a few people. So we're encouraging these natural history studies, these networks. First, they look at the people, and they can look at the biomarkers too. So what changes in ALS? What can we measure? Can we measure something that gives us an indication that treatment might be working, right? And then as soon as a therapy becomes available, then you can rapidly get people into a trial, and there would be no delays, because there's no delaying in ALS.
Right, exactly. And that's, obviously part of the concern, and certainly I agree with my colleague in talking about right to try. This would be a perfect example of decisions that families and patients can make. I do want to talk about, you had also mentioned listening carefully to patients and families.
Yes.
And, do you consider and give more weight? I mean, that's one of our questions is, how much weight are you giving to the patients and families? And what, there again, from our perspective in Congress, what can we do? As we have heard, everyone agreeing that we need to make a difference here and we can move things forward. How open is the FDA to this possibility, and what can we do right now to make this happen?
Well, as I said in my testimony in the beginning, medical culture has changed over the years, and used to be very doctor-centric, okay, and now it's patient-centric. And the FDA culture in drugs is a medical culture, and so that has changed at the same time, but slowly. So we've been working, though, very diligently with patient groups and so forth to try to get the patient point of view more central to the evaluation of benefit and risk, and what it means to the person who's actually has the disease, is going to take the drug. To answer your question, what can be done? I think a lot of this needs to be done out in the community. The patient groups need to get organized and develop these. Some of them are working with PCORI and trying to use that mechanism to get more information available and so forth. We have gotten draft guidances from different groups, including muscular dystrophy, that really are a statement of, this is what we care about, this is what we value, this is what we want you to look at, and we will pay extremely close attention to those, and those are extremely valuable.
Thank you, Dr. Woodcock, and I yield back the remainder.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady. Now, we are voting on the floor. We have 10 minutes left in the vote. We have 3 more questioners. Mr. Guthrie, recognized 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to be brief. So I'll echo what the others said about your testimony. Appreciate it. But since we started this 21st Century Cures, and everybody's excited, both sides trying to how we can do this better, and I've heard from a lot of groups, and I've heard from several times that the oncology division, it seems to be one people really like to work with, and it works well. Some of the other divisions in Expedition does not as well to work with. And I've always believed, Jack Kemp used to say, don't study failures and point out the problems. Let's look at successes and see how it can be replicated. So within your own agency, you're having wonderfully successful programs, at least according to the feedback I've gotten, and some not as fun, I mean, as the ability to work with. So I guess my question is there any impediment to saying, hey, the oncology is what we hear about more, and not that the others aren't, but we hear more. Is there any impediment to taking what's happening there and transferring it through other agencies? Is there something Congress can do to make it easier, or is it just learning and moving forward?
Let me tell you that 10 years ago, I heard a lot of negative comments about oncology, our oncology group, all right? And now we have therapies that are so effective. They're really on fire. They see that for their patients they took care of, they're all oncologists, hem-onc doctors, that these new treatments would really have made a difference for those people. And so they're doing everything they can to get those treatments out. And I think what we need the same kind of inspiring therapies in these other areas. And I do think they're doctors, they're physicians, they care about patients in their disease area. And this breakthrough, I don't know whether you can see it here, but you see that other disease areas are coming up, and we are designating in neurology and anti-infectives and psychiatry, we're designating potential breakthroughs. And so this type of thing will really help. But also, of course, we try to have a management structure, multiple mechanisms whereby we have consistency and uniformity of our approach and our procedures. And I think we do quite well in our procedures, but I think underlying sort of the attitude may have something to do with the underlying science. We had a war on cancer. It's starting to pay off, and we need to really expedite that.
Well, thanks. And I have a bill particularly to put the same status for professional budget judgment status for Alzheimer, which we're going to spend in 2050 $1 trillion. That's just not loss of income, loss of productivity. That's $1 trillion spent on that disease. That's when I'm 86. So that's when my children and our grandchildren will be taking care of it. So hopefully we can have the same inspiration and do that, particularly in Alzheimer's. I can assure you that if we found if there were promising treatments for Alzheimer's, we would jump right on them. Appreciate that. Thank you very much. And I'll yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Recognize the gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Woodcock. I have basically one question that I do want to get to. Looking at the QIDP and the moving forward of that, pardon me, it can give up to 5 years of additional data exclusivity. Bipartisan effort, we were all for it. What I want to know from you is how many QIDPs has the FDA designated to date, how many products have actually been approved to date, and do you believe that the QIDP is an important designation?
It's absolutely important.
Okay.
We have granted 50 designations for 34 unique molecules, and in the last several weeks we've approved the first 2 medications that are designated, the first 2 antimicrobials. So that's making a difference. We do feel, though, that probably more needs to be done.
And in that more needs to be done, give me a couple of examples of what you think the next step should be. I'd be interested in that.
Well, we are very interested in the pathway that people call limited population antibacterial drugs or other streamlined pathways for development that would be matched with some sort of symbol or logo that would enable doctors and other prescribers to recognize that it was from a limited program. We think that would also allow us to streamline the development program.
Excellent. And I just, for the second panel, want to welcome a fellow Tennessean, Dr. Marshall Summer, who is going to be speaking on behalf of the National Organization of Rare Diseases. So welcome. We're delighted you're here, and I will yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady. Now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bilirakis, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, and thank you for your testimony, Dr. Woodcock. I asked these questions a few months ago, and I didn't get a response, so I'm going to see if I can get a response this time. Appreciate it if you can answer. Can you tell me how many treatments were approved with novel biomarkers used for the first time?
No, I don't have that in the.
You get that information.
I would be happy to. It's
awesome.
a very interesting question. Yes.
Yeah. And then next question: have any accelerated approvals occurred with a novel biomarker and never before treated disease?
Oh yes, all the time. Okay. And I can get that for you. I don't have it again.
Please, how many new biomarkers did the FDA accept for a first-time use in the last 5 years?
Certainly.
Can you get that for me?
Absolutely.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'll yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. There are about 2 minutes left in the vote on the floor, so we're going to recess. There are 2 votes. As soon as we have the second vote, we will come back and reconvene with our second panel Again, Dr. Woodcock, thank you for coming. You've been a terrific witness. Members will have follow-up questions. We'll send them to you. We ask that you please respond. Thank you, and thank you for your patience. The subcommittee stands in recess. Time of recess having expired, we will reconvene the Subcommittee on Health and introduce our second panel. On our second panel, we have 5 witnesses. I'll introduce them in order of their presentation. First, Ms. Pat Furlong, founding president and CEO of the Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy. Secondly, Mr. Robert Beal, president and CEO of Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. Third, Mr. Richard Pops, chairman and CEO of Alkermes. Fourthly, Dr. Leonard Lichtenfeld, deputy chief medical officer of American Cancer Society. Finally, Dr. Marshall Summer, director, Scientific Advisory Committee, National Organization for Rare Disorders. Thank you all for coming. You'll each be given 5 minutes to summarize your testimony. Your written testimony will be placed in the record. Ms. Furlong, we'll start with you. You're recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you, and good morning, Chairman Pitts and members of the committee. My name is Pat Furlong. 20 years ago, I joined other parents to form Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy to end Duchenne, one of the many forms of muscular dystrophy and the most common lethal genetic disorder diagnosed in childhood. In 1984, I received the horrific diagnosis on my 2 sons, Christopher and Patrick, and both of my sons are gone now. I waged this crusade in their honor. Much has happened over the past 15 years to transform the Duchenne clinical and research landscapes, and much of this is a direct result of the actions by Congress and this committee, notably the enactment of the Child's Health Act in 2000 and the Muscular Dystrophy Care Act 1 year later. Since the MD Care Act was enacted, we've seen about 10 years added to the lifespan of patients with Duchenne. There has been an improvement in quality of life, driven largely by the development and dissemination of care standards, so that all patients can be diagnosed accurately and as early as possible and provided with the highest quality of care. The MD Care Act also transformed the Duchenne research landscape. What was just 12 years ago a near barren field has evolved into a robust area of research where multiple potential therapies are in clinical testing and several others are in early stages of development. Despite these advancements, Duchenne remains a fatal disease without any FDA-approved therapies. Most boys end up in wheelchairs by their mid-teens, and only a few live beyond their late 20s. Our community needs therapies, and we need them fast. To achieve this goal, PPMD has led groundbreaking efforts over the past year to address 2 major impediments in our quest to end Duchenne. One is a lack of regulatory understanding of patient and parent perspectives on benefit risk, and 2, a lack of clear guidance or direction to the biopharmaceutical companies designing these clinical trials. PPMD partnered with Johns Hopkins University to conduct the first ever scientific survey on benefit risk perspectives. The survey involved 120 parents of Duchenne children. It validated what we have known anecdotally for years. Because Duchenne is 100% fatal at a young age, many patients and families are willing to accept higher levels of risk in return for the prospect of potential benefit. The data has been shared with the FDA and was recently published in an academic journal. Now the FDA must ensure its reviewers apply this evidence to their decision-making process. Another impediment to drug development, particularly in rare diseases, is the absence of a clear guidance from FDA when it comes to designing clinical trials. Small patient populations, limited knowledge about the condition, and a lack of accepted or validated biomarkers are some of these challenges. At the invitation of the FDA, PPMD led a comprehensive 6-month effort to convene key stakeholders, patients, parents, clinicians, researchers, and industry to write a draft guidance document that would address trial design and many other issues. This was submitted to the FDA last month, marking the first time a patient group has led the development of such a product. Now the FDA must step up promptly to review the draft, gather stakeholder input, and issue a guidance document under the agency's name. While each of these projects is focused on Duchenne, each also offers a template or a model that could be applied to other diseases or other conditions, particularly rare diseases, and I hope other organizations will take on similar programs. So what can Congress and federal agencies do moving ahead? First, you can make sure that the patient perspective on benefit risk and other issues is considered by reviewers of the FDA. One way to do so could be by establishing a non-burdensome step where reviewers would disclose how they did or did not take such information into account making their decisions on a drug application. This would shed light on for what is many considered a mysterious process and could be done in a very simple manner. Second, I suggest an even greater focus on regulatory science so the FDA keeps pace with the breakneck speed of innovation. Specifically, NIH could bolster support for regulatory science research and infuse that into clinical and translational awards. Incorporating a regulatory perspective earlier in the pipeline can maximize the likelihood that candidate therapies will be ready for the rigor of the FDA. Finally, I would encourage greater flexibility in clinical trials, particularly rare fatal conditions like Duchenne that have small populations. Business as usual trial designs simply do not hit the mark when working with these populations. The Duchenne community has traveled a great distance over the past 15 years, thanks in significant part to the leadership of this very committee, leadership that will continue on Monday with action by the full committee on the MD Care Act amendments. Far too many families, my own included, this journey has not been fast enough. We stand ready to work with your committee to make sure the 21st Century Cures Initiative ends Duchenne and so many other rare diseases. Thank you.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady. Mr. Beal, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you very much for this invitation to present this testimony. The story of cystic fibrosis is clearly a story of determination, of hope, and optimism. The progress that we have documented in our submission really shows what is possible when a system works well, when patients, when stakeholders, and the regulatory agencies collaborate to develop life-changing treatments. Cystic fibrosis is clearly a life-threatening genetic disease that affects about 30,000 individuals in the United States. There has been tremendous progress in life expectancy over the decades. In the 50s, people with cystic fibrosis barely lived to elementary school. But there are people that are living today with cystic fibrosis in their 30s and 40s, and some are even going beyond. But we still lose too many patients at very young ages. The increase in life expectancy is due in large part to groundbreaking advancements and treatments made possible because of the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, our patient community, and our industry collaborators. 2 years ago, the FDA approved Kalydeco, the first drug to treat the underlying causes of cystic fibrosis in a small subset of people with the disease. Hailed as a game changer, it has transformed the lives of those taking this drug. It is a perfect example of personalized medicine. I might mention that the FDA approved this drug in near record time, 3 months before the prescribed PDUFA date and months before the EMEA. Just 2 weeks ago, we saw another breakthrough in cystic fibrosis. It happened when the positive data from a phase 3 clinical trial for a new therapy that is targeted at 40% of the CF population. This data was released by Vertex Pharmaceutical Company. You know, these products would not have been possible without the breakthroughs that have taken place in basic research and all the efforts that our foundation has made over the years. The CF community was thrilled to learn that the trial participants showed a significant improvement in lung function, weight gain, and 30 to 40% reduction in exacerbations. That's the time that they would have to go to the hospitals or have IV infections. So this is clearly a game changer for these patients. Obviously, Vertex plans to submit the new drug application to the FDA by the end of the year for this treatment. What is exciting about this progress is that these drugs would not have been possible were it not for the foundation and our patient community. Our commitment to scientific discovery and drug development is at the root of our success, but it hasn't been easy and it hasn't occurred overnight. In 1965, we created the first patient registry in the United States, now a model for chronic disease. Because of this registry, we have a documented natural history of cystic fibrosis. We have mutation analysis on most of these patients, as Dr. Woodcock referred to this morning. And we have the ability to have post-marketing phase 4 follow-up on these new drugs as they're introduced to the community. The same year, in 1965, we created a care center network. 90% of all patients seen in the United States are seen at these CFF-accredited and funded care centers. In 1989, through our support, the CF gene was discovered, 12 years before the human genome was completed. In 1998, we established a clinical trials network, the first clinical trials network founded solely by a nonprofit institution, organization like the Foundation. It is a critical component of our ability to conduct CF clinical trials efficiently and effectively. In 1999, the CF Foundation pioneered a successful venture philanthropy model to de-risk companies from investing in CF research drug development. It was our initial investment of $42 million in a small biotech company in San Diego that ultimately led to Kalydeco. Vertex would not have had Kalydeco and the other drugs announced last week were it not for the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. The CF Foundation spearheads collaboration across all sectors, and this same collaborative spirit extends to the Foundation's strong partnership with the Food and Drug Administration. With the FDA, we are committed to collaboration and bringing strong data to the table. It has often been stated that the CF Foundation comes with data, not demands. Just last week, we met with FDA officials to discuss strategies for clinical research design that may not occur until 5 years from now. However, curing a disease is never easy, and even more risky is the approval of drugs without sufficient data to assure efficacy and safety. If this happens, you place patients immediately at risk, and you risk losing the opportunity to test drugs that could have a real impact and beneficial effect. So in closing, what can Congress do for us? Congress should make sure that patients have a seat at the table, as was just referred to. Congress must provide the necessary resources so that the FDA can attract the best and the brightest. And Congress must provide the NIH and FDA sufficient resources for regulatory sciences, as also mentioned. But finally, Congress, we also encourage that they look at the CTSA program, a network of care centers that are funded by the NIH, and see how they might use these to be able to facilitate clinical trial network and the development of patient registries in other rare diseases. So once again, thank you for this opportunity to add the CF community's perspective to this important discussion.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Mr. Pops, you recognize 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Pallone, and all the members of the committee for inviting me to testify. I also want to thank Chairman Upton and Congresswoman Paget for spearheading the 21st Century Cures Initiative.
Is your mic on?
Now it is. Thank you. And I'd also like to express my respect for and appreciation for the folks on this panel and for Dr. Woodcock. We're all partners in this together, and it's an incredibly important mission. The simple and powerful concept of incorporating insights from patients is centrally important to the future of the nation's healthcare system. And it's also one of the great opportunities for us all to have a transformative impact. I've served as the CEO of Alkermes for over 20 years. Our company develops medicines for people living with chronic debilitating diseases such as opioid addiction, schizophrenia, and depression. Our approach is entirely dependent upon considering the patient perspective early and consistently throughout the drug development process. I also serve on the boards of both bio and pharma and was deeply involved in the PDUFA 5 negotiations as well as the preparations ongoing for PDUFA 6, where elevating the patient voice has already emerged as a key theme for that initiative. Today, I'd like to propose a new framework for patient involvement in developing new medicines, which requires engagement from all 3 of the major parties involved: innovative biopharmaceutical companies like ours, FDA, and the patients who stand to benefit from these medicines. And the framework is based on 3 core principles. First is that interactions must be data-driven, based on science, other than and separate from powerful and passionate advocacy messages that patient groups otherwise deliver. Second, the engagement framework should be actionable, not theoretical. It should improve the overall efficiency of the process rather than adding new steps in a process that's already incredibly complicated. This is particularly important for young biotechnology companies who are developing their first drugs on limited resources. Third, the approach should preserve and enhance FDA's gold standard of safety and efficacy, which is really one of our great national treasures. I believe deeply, personally, that increased patient input can coexist with efficiency and the highest level of scientific rigor. So from the industry's perspective, there's currently no consistent way to incorporate patient-generated input. This input would have a really meaningful impact on a range of critical decisions we and our researchers make. specific to particular product candidates and certainly to the way we design clinical trials and implement them around the world. This is an important missing link. As Dr. Woodcock mentioned, at the FDA, patient engagement is not a new concept. Several provisions included in PDUFA, as well as FDASIA, have resulted in meaningful new expansions of patient engagement. FDA has also been open to and has taken initial steps to include patient input into their reviews. We can build on this. The proposed framework I'm considering would build on all of these things. The historical paradigm of drug regulation as a bilateral process between FDA and industry is outdated. Science and society have continued to advance. Patients are organizing in new ways, and their critical role in driving innovation is becoming more the rule than the exception. We have 20th century regulatory framework for 21st century drug development. To include the increasingly or to tackle these increasingly complex scientific and regulatory issues as we look to treat and cure complex diseases, all three parties can work together to develop improvements to the existing regulatory framework. These would include new clinical trial designs, more efficient clinical trial enrollment methods, advancing FDA's evaluation of risk and benefit, and more sophisticated post-market data collection. These are incredibly exciting areas for future consideration. We'll need to evolve the way we work together, all the different parties, recognizing our shared responsibility to improve the efficiency of the development process and our accountability to assure that the medicines are safe and efficacious for patients. There'll be a number of challenges to this as we move in, and these could include establishing a common threshold for data and scientific rigor that's shared by patient industry groups and FDA, modifying existing regulations to accommodate this new framework, protecting intellectual property and data, which is essential to enabling innovation, and maintaining this gold standard of safety and efficacy. As next steps, I'd propose that Congress, industry, FDA, and patient groups come together to develop and implement this new framework, building on existing patient-focused provisions of PDUFA and FDASIA. We should also analyze existing statutes and regulations to identify impediments and opportunities. In conclusion, the concept of a new and comprehensive patient-inclusive framework is both ambitious and at the same time it's quite modest. It's ambitious as it could result in a dramatic change in the way we discover and develop medicines. It's modest because it's not a new regulatory pathway or authority, but it builds on an existing foundation. And we at Alkermes and all of our colleagues in the biopharmaceutical industry are standing by to help you in that effort, and really thank you very much for your leadership.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Dr. Lichtenfeld, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman Pitts, Ranking Member Pallone, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Dr. Len Lichtenfeld, and I'm Deputy Chief Medical Officer for the American Cancer Society, and truly appreciate the opportunity to be with you today to testify. The American Cancer Society is pleased to contribute to the dialogue around the committee's 21st Century Cures initiative. Today, I'd like to focus on 3 critical areas for the committee's consideration. One is the need for greater investment in research. Secondly, expedited approval processes that continue to ensure safety and efficacy of approved drugs. And third, making patients active partners in all aspects of research, development, and regulation of new therapies. We're fortunate and blessed that today we have 14 million cancer survivors in the United States. It's a remarkable number, and it's due to more effective treatments and improved screening tools that have been made possible through research. We must continue and expand our steadfast commitment to research, and we must continue to support researchers working on finding the next generation of cures. Just as important, we must ensure that expedited approval processes for drugs and devices are appropriately safe, effective, and accessible to patients. The goal of the 21st Century Cures Initiative is to accelerate the development and approval of new medical treatments. There are few other areas that can match the research and development activity in the field of cancer. It is, in fact, and has been a model of innovation. The FDA's Office of Hematology and Oncology Products has aggressively used the tools provided by Congress to speed new drugs to patients and has encouraged drug companies to be innovative in clinical trials. In the past 8 months, 3 cancer drugs have been approved using the accelerated pathway. One approval was based on a trial of 111 patients, an example of research and approvals happening faster and with smaller clinical trials than has been the case in the past. Small-sized trials and accelerated approval do have drawbacks. They may not include a diverse population, which may yield an incomplete picture of how a drug might work in a broader population. Small trials, accelerated approvals also tend to be seen in deadlier cancers where there are no other good therapeutic options. And I want to stress that the risk-benefit tolerance of a cancer patient facing a poor prognosis may be much different than for those with other available treatment options, and therefore the same acceptance of reduced data on which to base FDA approval may not be appropriate in other fields or for other diseases. Finally, I want to stress the importance of researchers, pharmaceutical companies, and the FDA in engaging widely and meaningfully with patients. The Food and Drug Administration Safety and Innovation Act requires greater patient involvement throughout the drug and device approval process. ACS can championed provisions to expand the FDA's patient representative program to maximize patient input during the drug development process. We need to continue to build on that progress. Patients can provide important perspectives at various stages of medical product development and regulation. They know more than anyone what is most important to patients, to themselves: symptom reduction, risk tolerance, and design elements that might affect trial recruitment or retention. This kind of patient involvement should be reinforced and supported, and to this end, the FDASIA provisions requiring FDA to address challenges that have hindered patient involvement must be fully implemented. We urge the committee to consider examining opportunities for providing greater funding to support the FDA patient representative program, as well as broader continued engagement with the patient community. Another important way patients' perspectives can inform development of therapies is through the design and use of patient-reported outcomes. Measures of cancer therapy effectiveness sometimes include functional status, pain, or quality of life measures, but these may be reported by the physician rather than by the patient. Quality of life measures like pain or nausea should come from patients themselves, and patients should help prioritize the importance of these side effects in the overall response to a disease and the associated treatments. When quality of life outcomes are rigorously measured and supported by the FDA, they should be included in a drug's labeling, and they should be considered for a drug's approval. The FDA should also be encouraged to work with industry and researchers to incorporate self-reported symptom measurements as a regular part of clinical trials. In closing, we appreciate the opportunity to contribute to the dialogue around the committee's 21st Century Cures initiative and look forward to working with the committee and its staff. I am happy to take any questions. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Now, Dr. Sommer, you recognize 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, Chairman Pitts, Ranking Member Pallone, and members of the subcommittee, and thank you for inviting me today. My name is Marshall Sommer. I have the good fortune to be the Chief of Genetics and Metabolism at Children's National Medical Center here in Washington, D.C. Been working in the field of rare diseases for the last 29 years, and I'm here today in my capacity as a member of the Board of Directors of the National Organization of Rare Disease and Chair of the Scientific Advisory Committee of NORD. On behalf of the estimated 30 million individuals with rare diseases, NORD thanks you and the Energy and Commerce Committee for your continued strong support of the rare disease community. You've made a huge difference for us. NORD's a unique federation of over 200 patient advocacy groups, clinicians, researchers dedicated to helping people with rare diseases. NORD provides resources, research advocacy, education, community, and infrastructure support to the rare disease community that small individual organizations cannot. It's the nature of rare diseases, they're small. NORD was founded in 1983 and played an active role in the passage of the Orphan Drugs Act, which is a successful model of how to incentivize the development of treatments that save lives. Data show that years of life lost to rare diseases declined at an annual rate of 3.3% after the Orphan Drug Act due to the development of new treatments. Without these new drugs, if you take them out of the equation, the number of years lives lost should have increased at about a 1% rate per year. So it's made a real impact on our patients. Speaking personally, without these treatments, many of my patients would not be here. I thank you for what you've already done. These efforts represent a good beginning, but there's much more we can do to improve the lives of our patients, and NORD views the 21st Century Cures initiative as a great way to do this. NORD's long advocated increased involvement of patients in the drug development process. We appreciate the commitment by many at the FDA to increase patient involvement, but believe much more needs to be done to make patients feel they are partners in the process. NORD will continue to work with the FDA to advance the patient role in the development and approval process. We've developed a series of recommendations that we believe will advance not only the development of new orphan drugs and devices, but non-orphan ones as well. We look forward to discussing these ideas with the committee as the 21st Century Cures initiative continues. Permit me to focus on two of our recommendations. First, we support the establishment of a commission and national plan to determine priorities, methods, resource needs, and a consistent agenda on rare disease registries and natural history studies. They've got a lot of variation. They tend to be all over the map. To assess a drug's efficacy, we need information on the existence, frequency, and severity of clinical findings. This information is needed before a clinical trial can begin. We encourage the creation and maintenance of programs to create, curate, and standardize registries and natural history studies which can generate this needed data. This could be one of the most important accelerators of the treatment development and monitoring process. These registries can also be used in the post-approval process as well. This is an area where patients can have a major and cost-saving impact on the process. Patient-entered data has been shown to be accurate and useful when collected properly. Creative hybrids using physician, patient, and other health professional collected data can greatly speed the understanding, discovery, approval, and monitoring process. In collaboration with the NIH and FDA, NORD has built and is in the process of testing a rare disease patient-driven registry natural history program. The NIH's Rare Disease Clinical Research Network has already demonstrated the benefits of this approach. In a registry I've been involved with, we've had approval of 3 drugs over a 10-year period with only 700 patients. So it definitely has accelerated the approval process for us. The Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute is developing new statistical methods and models to use data from rare disease patient studies that will further refine this process. They're also involved in patient-driven registries through PCORNet, and we'll begin working with NORD on our rare disease focused registry program. So we should have good input from multiple agencies. All of these efforts will help our patients, but a national plan and standards would help prevent duplicated effort and resources. This is what we truly need. The other thing we advocate is a significant reform to the Institutional Review Board system. I've been working with this system for the last 30 years, so I'm pretty familiar with all of its manifestations. Currently, all clinical trials for new treatments, whether a drug, biologic, or medical device, must receive approval from an IRB. Each institution and study site typically requires approval and protocol adjustment by its own IRB. With a large number of sites needed for rare disease study, this is one of the greatest impediments and costs to clinical trials. NORD recommends that Congress develop legislation that would de-risk the process and foster the creation of an IRB system that is portable across institutions. The de-risking of the IRB process and the encouragement requirement of reliance agreements between institutions receiving federal funding would save cost and time while accelerating the clinical trials and clinical research process greatly. This will significantly increase the pool of study sites and allow greater patient participation. These are just 2 of our recommendations. My written testimony includes the rest. And on behalf of NORD, I thank the committee for allowing us to testify today.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Thanks all the witnesses for your opening statements. And we'll now begin questioning. I'll recognize myself 5 minutes for that purpose. Ms. Furlong, we'll start with you. Do you believe your guidance collaboration with industry is a scalable model that can be used in other conditions? Specifically, were there unique factors that make Duchenne muscular dystrophy guidance a special case in the multi-stakeholder effort that you led with encouragement from the FDA?
Thank you, Chairman Pitts, for the question. I certainly think that this methodology and process is exportable to other rare conditions. How we started the guidance or initiated the guidance was to develop a steering committee that was representative of the stakeholders, which included patients, academia, as well as industry. From there, the steering committee identified several areas, 7 working groups actually, of things that they felt were relevant to include diagnosis, biomarkers, clinical trial design, natural history, and benefit risk. And then we further developed a CAB, which is the Community Advisory Board, so that would be incorporate the entire patient voice in any individual or patient group that wanted to contribute to the development of the guidance. The standardization for the guidance was that it would be a reference document and that it would include documented evidence that was published or accepted for publication by the end of July. So we felt, and we're writing up the methodology, that this methodology is exportable. It was certainly an investigation and a thorough, thoughtful, reasoned look at the community and the nuances of Duchenne. but I believe that most rare diseases could do the same. Their issues may be slightly different, and their progress to date might be slightly different, but it certainly is exportable.
Thank you, Dr. Beal. Communication with patients to make sure they can make informed decisions about clinical trial participation is critical. How does the cystic fibrosis community communicate with patients about the various options? And how do you think we can best translate your good practices into the Cures Initiative?
Thank you very much. First of all, we have because 90% of all of our CF patients are seen in a network of care centers, and that we also have a clinical trial network. There's a very close relationship between our physicians and the patients that are involved. And that's critical for the recruitment of patients into clinical trials. It's critically important for showing them the value and the risk of participating in clinical trials. And it's that close association between the physician and the patient and the recruitment process in a very closed network that is critical. That's why I think clinical trial networks are critically important. So we also have established within our clinical trials network a data safety monitoring board made up of, it's independent of the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, but it's made up of experts. And that provides a degree of assurance to every single patient that there's somebody looking out for their continuing interest and for any risk that may be inherent in any single trial. So I think all of these things, plus we have worked very hard to try to create a culture of participation and a responsibility that each patient, when you have a small patient population, needs to participate in the process. So I think that reassurance that is so important.
Thank you. Mr. Pops, what stage of drug development could most use the assistance of patient insight about benefit expectations and risk tolerance?
Thank you for the question. It's actually the most exciting part of the whole opportunity is that it's every stage. Actually, from identification of new drug candidates all the way through to determination of the value of the medicine after the completion of pivotal clinical trials. And I think that's the whole idea of this framework, is creating a structure where we can get that input on a continuous basis. And I think it could fundamentally transform the way we approach these development programs.
Thank you, Dr. Lichtenfeld. You've discussed examples of cancer drugs that have recently been successfully approved by FDA through an accelerated approval process. Are there best practices that we can learn from cancer and how FDA is expediting the approval process for particular drugs?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When we talk about best practices, I think what the question really came up with Dr. Woodcock earlier today. What are the oncology community doing that's different than other communities? Let's understand it's a complex process in the sense that we have had research that has been building literally for decades, that's produced very exciting results, that's actionable, and companies are standing up to create drugs for the targets that we're finding for the new immunotherapies for genetic disease, what have you, genetic markers. So we're in a sense an interesting and turning point kind of place. But important, relevant to your question, the Office of Hematology Oncology Products has also stepped up to the plate. And as was mentioned earlier, the oncology community appreciates the efforts of the FDA staff to reach out to the patient community, to reach out to the pharmaceutical community, to reach out to those who do clinical trials, to be active participants, to be at the table. LungMap was cited several times. The American Cancer Society is grateful to be able to have contributed to that effort among many other organizations. But the FDA has become an active partner with the process. And so I don't know if that's a best practice or a best example, but it's that source of communication. But let's not forget it's also the opportunity, because we're now in a place that we only dreamed of just a short while ago.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. My time's expired. Chair recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Pallone, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My questions are of Mr. Beal. The Cystic Fibrosis Foundation has done some great collaborative work that has resulted not only in successful marketing of Kalydeco, but also the recent positive test results of a complementary drug that may extend treatment to nearly half of all patients with CF. and of course I commend you for your efforts. But I wanted to ask you about a couple of points in your testimony. In your remarks, you spoke about the CF Foundation's strong relationship with the FDA and the importance of bringing good data to the table when consulting with the FDA, which I know is true. And I'd like to hear more about that relationship. Obviously, we're hearing a lot today about the need for FDA to do more to seek and incorporate patient input into its review process. So, basic question, Mr. Beal, is can you tell us more about the CF Foundation's interaction with the FDA, and are there any lessons that can be learned by other disease groups?
Well, I can give you a perfect example because on Wednesday of this week we had 3 officials, including Dr. Robert Temple, who is in the drug division at our offices, talking about the development of clinical trial protocols of drugs that might not enter into clinical trials to 3 to 5 years from now. So that's a perfect example of this open discussion because we have a natural history of the disease. We know that with the drugs that we've tested that treating the basic defect, we know the mechanism of action. We have a safety profile. And now we can start to talk about the future. And I think it's that kind of example. And that goes back many, many years. Soon after we discovered the CF gene, we talked about gene therapy. And we had extensive dialogues with the FDA, not only with manufacturers, but with the FDA and the foundation. So I could just say that we have always had a wonderful collaboration. We have data. We have natural history of the disease because of the patient registry. And again, we come with data, and we come with experience, and we come with the networks that can make these things happen. So I just give you an example. That was the example.
We're hearing a lot about the various expedited drug review processes at FDA, and there's clearly a push by many to get the agency to use these pathways more frequently and in more disease areas. And I share the goal of speeding new therapies to patients at the earliest possible time, but I think we need to be cognizant of the risks that could accompany that speed, and we especially need to be concerned about such risks if we're ultimately thinking about somehow requiring more frequent use of these expedited pathways through legislation. And I know you share that concern. Your testimony mentions the health risks that could result from approving therapies based on early data that needs more vigorous study, but you also describe the possibility that these kinds of approvals could endanger progress towards the development of other treatments. Can you just elaborate on both of those concerns, if you would?
Well, certainly one of the things when you're dealing with a small population, and now we're talking about personalized medicine, where we may only have 25 patients with a certain genotype that may be approachable by or therapeutic opportunities for that particular drug. If those patients were introduced a drug that was less than effective, what happens when the next drug that could be effective? How do you do the clinical trial? So I think that's really very critical because we want to make sure that our first introduction is drugs that are efficacious, and then we move forward to the next level. Because then we really are depriving, if you don't have safe drugs, of developing good drugs and effective drugs that could move us above the therapeutic options that we have. So I think that that's the critical thing that we always face. There's always the risk, but now we're dealing with small populations, personalized medicine. Maybe there's only going to be 6, 10, 1,000 patients. So I think you have to be particularly critical on that issue with rare diseases.
Okay. You know, I just wanted to echo another point you made in your testimony about the importance of resources, and I couldn't agree more that, as you say, FDA needs resources to ensure that they can rely on the best regulatory science available, and they need adequate resources to enable them to, basically to meaningfully engage with the patient community. And we have this 21st Century Cures initiative, which is progressing now. We've had some sort of larger meetings and now some hearings. And my colleagues always ask, what can Congress do? And I think that the most effective thing we can do is provide adequate resources to make sure that FDA as well as NIH have the resources to fulfill the expectations we have for both agencies. And I know I hear not only from the agencies but also from my constituents that, they don't have enough resources. So I think I just want to echo again what you said. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman, thanks, gentlemen. Now recognize the Vice Chairman of the subcommittee, Dr. Burgess, 5 minutes for questions.
Just before my time starts to run, could I make a unanimous consent request?
May I proceed?
I'd like to move that the committee make people aware that if someone wishes to contact or communicate with the Cures Initiative, it's cures@mail.house.gov. I know there are many people watching who think I would like to interact with committee staff, so that's the way to do it.
Thank you. Without objection, so ordered.
Very well. I knew they wouldn't deny me. Let me let me ask Ms. Furlong, you were kind enough to mention the work on the MD CARE Act, and thank you for that. As you know, we will likely be marking that up next week, so that's a big milestone. Can you talk about how the MD CARE Act needs updating and the type of updating that this committee has pursued?
Certainly, and thank you for the question, Dr. Burgess. The MD CARE Act was the solid foundation that set Duchenne and the muscular dystrophies, really galvanized their progress. So the MD CARE Act was passed, enacted in 2001, and reauthorized in 2008. And right now, the amendments are really to look at what we've learned in the meantime. So the cardiac issues in Duchenne muscular dystrophy are real, and they have to be tackled in order to answer the question as you look at these therapies, the potential therapies that we're hopeful to be approved in the next months and years. They extend function. Will they protect or have a negative effect on the heart? So it's the gaps that we need to really look at with the amendments. In addition to the fact that when this legislation was enacted in 2001, young boys with Duchenne didn't live to be adults. So now we have an adult population, and we need to really address those adults in terms of their medical care, and also to incentivize and understand how to treat them, how to encourage them to have long and independent lives as they become adults and reach for their dreams. So I think that the MD CARE Act is now looking with the Muscular Dystrophy Committee from the NIH and other agencies. The research plan has to be updated, and these amendments to be incorporated so that we are really achieving the full effect that the MD CARE Act was initiated for.
Thank you. And of course, Mr. Beal also acknowledged that the population of patients is changing because of some of the successes that has happened over the past several years, and in both of those illnesses, both cystic fibrosis and muscular dystrophy, it is important that we keep pace with the way the patient population is changing. We want people to live longer and fuller lives with their conditions, and at the same time, we don't want the legislation then to stymie that. So it's, in my opinion, an important step forward. Dr. Beal, you talked about the development of mutation-specific therapies and the next evolution in precision medicine, and you could see the cystic fibrosis example impacting the way we address other serious illnesses. Is there something more you'd like to add to that?
Well, again, we're clearly in the age of personalized medicine. I mean, fortunately, with the completion of the human genome, we understand the genetics of so many diseases and genetic diseases that it is a very critical time for us. I just saw Dr. Collins downstairs, and he's excited about because he was one of the discoverers of our CF gene. So we live in a very unique age, and I think more and more therapies are going to be directed to specific mutations. And that's one of the reasons that we have to have these kinds of patient registries so we can start to identify those mutations. When Vertex felt that they had a drug that might work on a certain mutation, this small drug that came out, G551D, we were able to tell them in the United States we have 1,100 of those patients within 5 minutes after they ask us because of a patient registry, because we have a documented history of the disease. So I think that's why it's very important to have personalized medicine therapies and the options for that, but it's also we have to be able to document the patients that can participate in the trials.
Yeah, it is very powerful. And of course, you referenced the 1965 registry. In 1965, you didn't know that we were going to know about the sequence of the human genome 30 years later.
Well, but we've been able to document. Today, we have 26,000 patients whose data is provided to our patient registry every single year.
Let me ask you a question. I'm going to run out of time pretty quickly, and this is either for Mr. Bell or Mr. Pops. You know, the world is different now, and you have people that are perhaps lucky enough to enter into a clinical trial, and they're likely to, perhaps have friends with the same condition. So in the old days, a randomized clinical trial, you wouldn't know which arm to which you were randomized, who was getting the target or study drug who was getting either an older therapy or no therapy, but now people communicate. Facebook, Twitter, they're likely to be Facebook friends. How is that going to impact the ability to have a blinded randomized clinical trial? Are people likely to communicate with each other? I mean, look, I'm getting a lot better on this stuff. How about you? Wait a minute, I haven't seen a darn thing.
I think it's a real question. It's a real issue and you can't pretend that it's not going to happen. This is already happening, particularly as you get large cohorts of patients in randomized studies in multiple countries. They're all communicating. So I think it's very important that we be really rigorous in maintaining the blind to the extent that we can.
To the extent that we can, but also we probably need to embrace the fact that the information is out there and being communicated, and to the extent that it can further enhance what we're doing.
So let's take advantage of it. Let's do more in the aftermarket. Let's approve drugs and collect this information and get a more nuanced view of the drug's use in the real world and turn it to our advantage.
And in some cases, it's going to make it easier to do clinical trials. When you can have large networks that exist out there, when they can report patient-reported outcomes and things like that. So I think sometimes it's to look at it as a disadvantage, but we ought to turn it, as Mr. Pops just said, we ought to turn it to an advantage, because I think it can expedite the ability to do clinical trials as we move forward with the technology.
Great.
And it should expedite post-hoc analysis so that we can see the long-term effects, because in a clinical trial of 12 months, for instance, or plus or minus, you might not see the full effect of a drug that is multi-systemic. So it will enable us to understand the full impact on the patient's life.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Now I recognize the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky. 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much. I had a question for Dr. Lichtenfeld, and actually for anyone on the panel that wants to comment on this. This is about quality of life outcomes. I mean, obviously, if this is a known life-threatening disease, you want to do everything you can to make sure that the therapies match the disease. But there are, you'd say, when these quality of life outcomes are rigorously measured and supported by the FDA, they can and should be included in drugs labeling and can by themselves be a basis for a drug's approval. I certainly know people who have suffered so much from side effects of drugs, and I just wonder, in the whole process of drug approvals, how much are these quality of life issues really looked at as a basis for approval, or just as a basis of whether or not they're used?
Thank you for your question. In fact, it's a work in progress. Let's understand that quality of life is a buzzword today, but it wasn't a buzzword very recently. So as we look at the issues, shall we say, of palliative care, of supportive care, quality of life, issues that the American Cancer Society and many others have been involved in, it's relatively new to the table. Having said that, there have been issues recently with one particular drug, where the question really centered around even though the drug may not have met the FDA standard, and this was about 2 years ago, even though it had not met the FDA standard, did it meet the quality of life standard? Did it improve the quality of life of the having to be a breast cancer drug for the women who took it? Because that would have been an important consideration. And unfortunately, the quality of the data measuring quality of life was inadequate. Mm-hmm. So going forward, I mean, cancer patients have enough on their plates, as do everyone represented at this table, as do patients throughout this country. We need to be aware the quality of life is an important part of the treatment process. And we need to have tools in place. They're not uniform yet. They're not as good as we would like, but they have to be in place to measure quality of life, and that has to be considered, and patient-reported outcomes are very much a part of that process.
Yes, go ahead, Doctor.
I just wanted to make a comment as it relates to patients with chronic disease as well. We talked a lot about cancer and orphan, small diseases. We work in the field of chronic disease, schizophrenia, depression, addiction, where patients are taking medicines for long, long periods of time. Mm-hmm. And simple things that may seem prosaic to the researcher, like nausea, fatigue, propensity to get addicted or dependent on a drug, These are really important inputs that we want to hear from patients about.
And is that part of the process?
It's less part of the approval process today than I think it will be in the future. It's certainly part of the utilization process as patients make a determination, which medicine do I want to stay on for years and months. I think that's a critical part of it, but it's not really incorporated in the consideration of the approval.
Especially where all things might be equal in effectiveness, whether or not something causes nausea, fatigue, could be really important.
Particularly if we're launching a new medicine into a large category where there might be an abundance of generic drugs that are safe and effective, but might not hit all those parameters for certain subsets of patients for long periods of time. And we just want people to be sensitive to the fact that from the patient perspective, there are differences between the medicines.
Right. I also, Dr. Lichtenfeld, wanted to ask you about small-sized trials. And you mentioned one of the drawbacks. I had talked about the extent to which women aren't considered. And I would just be concerned. I understand the plus, I do, but if we rely too heavily on them, isn't there the real risk of excluding important populations?
Well, the answer is yes, there is a real risk of excluding important populations. In fact, when you talked about women and heart disease, I remember back in the early 1990s when the article came out talking about the absence of women in clinical trials for the treatment of hypertension and heart disease. So it's an issue I'm aware of. But let's talk about the other side of the coin, and that is when you're sitting, and I have sat in the presentations at ASCO, at the oncology meetings, and you see a presentation of 80 patients, and you see what we call waterfall plots, basically the responses in survival that occur, and suddenly, not 70% of those patients are having significant responses. Mm-hmm. I don't think in a disease where there was no treatment before, I don't think one asked the question. I mean, they asked the question in follow-up, but not at the moment. And what has happened and what's been exciting to me is I'm now sitting in those presentations every June, and I actually wrote about it. It took a year for one of the drugs to go from clinical trial to approval because it was that effective in a disease where there was no other treatment available. That's pretty spectacular. That's new thinking. That's a new approach. Now, we've learned more as time has gone on, yes. Doesn't mean we've stopped learning, as was mentioned before, about cystic fibrosis. But when you suddenly see moments like that, no one would want to hold back. Develop the data, yes, but don't hold back the opportunity. In fact, even a phase 1 trial that was presented at this ASCO meeting in June, the company, actually, well, not the company, but ASCO in the press release indicated the company was willing after a phase 1 trial to put it into compassionate use. And that's pretty, again, pretty amazing and a major change in the way that traditionally we have seen cancer drugs move through the pipeline.
Thank you. I've overstayed my time. Thank you.
Chair, thanks to the gentlelady. Now I recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, 5 minutes for questions.
Dr. Lichtenfeld, let's pick up there because I think that compassionate use is something that we really need to be figuring out how we can make it more effective and how we can do it faster. At the federal level, you talked about in your testimony that patients needed to be involved both on saying, if they had what kind of nausea they had and what the pain levels were and so forth, and I agree with that. But I also think that particularly when you have no treatment, that patients need to be involved in that too. And as Ms. Furlong said earlier, when there isn't a treatment, you're much more willing to take those risks than you would be if there's some other treatment out there that might work, but this might be a little more comfortable. And I want to give both you and Ms. Furlong an opportunity just to address that further.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate the question. I know you mentioned it earlier. It is a complex issue. It is not a new issue. As you may well be aware, it's been around for some time with a number of drugs that have gone through the pipeline, which seem to show some opportunities. There are a substantial, and I also know it's under various state legislatures are involved. I'm sitting here today, both as a representative of the society, but also as an individual, and understand that there are discussions on both sides of that issue, and they're complicated. Bottom line is that we need to understand what drugs work when they work. We need to understand that patients need to have access to promising drugs as soon as possible. Companies make those decisions as to how they're going to handle that process. The FDA, as a matter of fact, has approved almost all the applications they received, and we need to have those discussions to come to a better resolution about how to address that issue.
Well, and what I would say is that whatever that we can do, I think I speak for a lot of the members of the committee, I'm probably a little more out there than some, but whatever we can do to help by changing the law to expedite that process, we will do.
We'd be glad to have those discussions on behalf of the society.
Ms. Furlong, did you want to make another comment about risk assessment? Because obviously when your boys were sick, you probably would have taken anything that had any promise of hope.
I think I could tell you stories about looking in China to see some tea that you might be appalled about, but that was long ago. I think this also, it really is up to the companies. FDA has always, to my knowledge, at least in the Duchenne and other fields, been willing to entertain and talk about compassionate use. I think for the rare disease community, this really talks about and gets us back to trial design. In general, trials are designed to test a small subset of patients. In the Duchenne community, the 6-minute walk test is the standard outcome, primary outcome measure. So that means as a child with Duchenne, you have to walk 6 minutes. And even further, as we learn more about the testing, it's a very narrow subset of people within a certain framework of that 6-minute walk test, which, as you can imagine, leaves a great number of people outside the trial. So I think trials have to be designed that are inclusive and welcoming of people that live with the spectrum of the illness, both very young as well as adults with very limited functional ability. And that way we can test those in those populations. We can have labels that are broad and then provide access to all. So I think that might be a better solution.
Thank you. Look forward to working with you all. And with that, I'll yield the remainder of my time to Dr. Burgess.
Well, I thank the gentleman. Dr. Lichtenfeld, I just wanted to follow up with you because your specialty has been involved in this type of activity probably longer than any other branch of clinical medicine. I think going back to 1955 when the developmental therapeutics program was put into place at the National Cancer Institute. So with that longitude, that breadth of experience within your specialty, are there things that you want to share with others about what that experience has taught you?
Well, what we did back in 1965 or whenever was a lot different than what we're doing today. I don't want to take the time to really go into it. You may be aware of it. But here's the message. It didn't happen overnight. It took 40 years of research to get us to the tipping point where we understood the genome and had the opportunity to take advantage of that and move forward. Immunotherapy, the same story. It has taken us 40 years. That was a substantial amount. I don't want to underestimate the value of research investment to get us to the point where we are, where suddenly we look like we have so much to offer and to do. I also comment with regard to my co-panelists that they have populations and they have demonstrated that finding the patients where they are is critically important. We have a substantial amount of work to do to understand not only the clinical trial mechanism, but also the medical practice system, so we can make sure that patients and communities, I live in a small town in South Georgia, that my friends have opportunities to get these drugs from clinical trials and be part of that process. There's a lot of work to do.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Pallone, for holding this hearing. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to further consider how patient perspectives can best be incorporated into the therapeutic development process. As the author of the AALS Registry Act and the Paul D. Wellstone Muscular Dystrophy Community Assistance Research and Education Amendments of 2008 and 2013, along with my colleague Dr. Burgess, I've worked to be a voice for those with rare and orphan diseases. I'm encouraged by the advances we've made into the causes and mechanisms of these diseases, as well as our progress toward treatments, but obviously we still have a long way to go. One of the most striking gains we've made is for individuals with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. As Ms. Furlong mentioned, our efforts have added an average of 10 years to the life expectancy of boys with Duchenne, and now as life expectancy increases, we face new challenges in finding effective therapies. The patient community brings an important perspective and understanding to this process, and I'm interested to see how we can best use that knowledge to assist medical researchers with therapy development. So, Ms. Furlong, let me ask you this. I'm particularly interested in the way the Duchenne patient community is engaged with the FDA to help inform the benefit-risk determinations made by agency reviewers, as well as the Duchenne Community Guidance document you referred to in your prepared testimony. Could you please comment on how you hope to see these efforts affect the therapeutic pipeline and the various stakeholders who are part of that pipeline?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Engel, for the question. The benefit risk really originated out of discussions with the FDA, because in our discussions, our early discussions, it was known that we were telling anecdotal stories that the equation of benefit risk was different in, for instance, Duchenne muscular dystrophy than perhaps a more common disease. And in that, the FDA suggested to us that they agreed, but they didn't have anything they could rely on, any quantified evidence-based document that could help them make those decisions. So we agreed to go out on benefit risk and did the pilot with 120 parents. We learned that their priority is disease stabilization, and they were willing to accept a great deal of risk. In fact, they're living with a great deal of risk as they know that their child has a fatal illness. So the FDA has now asked us to expand that study to a greater number of patients than 120 patients, and also to ask these questions of the young men with Duchenne. Our hope is that they will incorporate it into the review process, and they will demonstrate to us how and when they use it and when they don't, and what makes sense for them as they make their decisions.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your advocacy and hard work. It's very much appreciated. Dr. Samar, can you talk about the role you think that patient perspective should play in developing therapies for diseases like ALS and muscular dystrophy that have limited treatment options and for which quality of life is obviously an especially important factor to patients? How can the FDA best consider the views of patients and families when examining the benefit-risk calculus for these diseases?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Engel. This really kind of expands across the entire field of rare diseases, but your question is particularly relevant for those two groups. Patients often tell us about things that they wish were better that we never thought of. One of the things I've run across time and time again is when we go and ask our patients, what's the worst part of this disease? A lot of times it's parents in the case of pediatric patients. And they'll list things, and sometimes the things we thought were the most important are number 9 or 10 on the list. So I think when we look at what our therapeutic targets are, what our quality of life targets are for these diseases, patient and family input is a huge factor. And I think it's something we can incorporate a lot better than we have. I think during the early stages, particularly when we're designing our pivotal trials, clinical trials, looking at what endpoints are, I think those are going to become more and more important. The other thing, of course, is the small group sizes with these. Many times it's hard to pick one single outcome variable that you're going to be able to achieve. The smallest study I've been involved with was 5 patients for an approval process. Getting one exact target for that, fortunately the effect of the drug was massive, so we were able to do it. But if it had been a milder, I might have needed more than one outcome variable. So I think families can help us determine what's important there. They can help us also, as we talked about, with some of what risk is tolerable in those situations. It's different. There are 7,000 different rare diseases. Each one of these is unique in its own regard, but there are some commonalities like that.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your comments, and also thank you for your interest, and I want to thank the panel for a very interesting discussion. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks to the gentleman. Now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bill Arakis, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, and thank the panel for their testimony today. I know we've been talking about this, and you've had an opportunity. I want to give you more of an opportunity to respond on this. On Wednesday, I asked one of the witnesses about his statement in including patients in the clinical trial process. But I want to make sure that y'all have every opportunity to respond to this. If patients had a greater role in clinical trial design, and I know you've touched upon this, if trials measured qualitative data from patients, like how do you feel, is it less painful, what have you, how would things be different, and what would you like to see? We'll start with the...
I'd like to start. First of all, the patient-reported outcomes, I think, has been part of every clinical trial in cystic fibrosis for the last 10 or 15 years. Some of the tools are not the best at this point, but we're working to refine them. We have just spent, as a foundation, a large effort to look at patient-reported outcomes to find a specific validated tool for CF. and it's going to be submitted to the FDA and go through a validation process. In the past, we've used one that was generally for lung disease, but it may not be specific. So this is a science that's evolving. I mean, you know, a decade ago or 15 years ago, 20 years ago, PROs were not really incorporated. So it's a science that's evolving, and it has to be evolved with not only with the FDA, it has to be evolved with the sponsors too, because they got to be willing to incorporate those into the clinical trial process. So I'm encouraged by the process, but I will tell you, just in this last trial we had, where the lung function went up and the exacerbations went down, we didn't have a statistically significant improvement in the patient-reported outcomes, because we're treating when you're starting to treat the basic defect, you're treating the whole disease process, and you're looking at extending lives. And the patients may not feel that from day to day, but over years you may have a tremendous impact on those patients. So it's a tool that can be used, but it shouldn't be used exclusively.
Well, thank you very much. Ms. Furlong, do you want to respond?
Sure. So I agree with Dr. Beal, and patient-reported outcomes are incredibly important. But I think this is where involving the patients in the design and conduct of clinical trials is really going to be important. Because, for instance, how do we measure energy and endurance? Right. How do we know that turning over in bed is important to patients as opposed to an outcome measure such as the 6-minute walk test? So I think things are important to patients that have a ripple effect on their lives. For instance, as you can imagine, if a boy can still text at the age of 18, that gives him independence. If a child can walk up a single step, they can enter buildings. If a child can roll over in bed, that makes the family's quality of life overall, in general, much, much better. So I think the use of patient-reported outcomes and including the patient voice in the discussion about what the clinical trial looks like and what the measurements are, both primary and secondary, is going to be incredibly important.
Thank you so much. Mr. Pops, do you have a comment? Or?
I think these outcomes are so critical in the world that we're developing drugs in, which is in psychiatry often, in schizophrenia, depression, addiction. The end point of the clinical trial, the hard end point, is asking people essentially how they feel. And so how you feel is typically embodied in a set of validated scales, but those often don't capture some of the most important parts of how they actually feel over time. A perfect example might be in opioid dependence or alcohol dependence, where a critical question that patients ask us when they take our medicine is my craving going to go down? Am I going to crave this less? It may block the receptor and keep me from drinking, but is my craving going to change? That was not a validated endpoint. That was something we couldn't incorporate in the label, but it's essential to patients' perception of the disease.
Good point. Doctor?
About 4 weeks ago at ASCO, the oncology meetings, they showed a picture of a lady who was 96 years old, who had received a phase 1 drug. That in itself is a fascinating point, whose cancer completely resolved. And on the bottom end of the before and after picture, on the after picture, you saw a trace of a little smile. And I noticed that smile, and I tweeted it, actually. I took a picture and tweeted it, and it got retweeted quite a bit. And then the lecturer said, yes, that really is a smile in front of 2,000 people. What I'm trying to say is, by that example, is that's what we have to be able to measure and aggregate in a scientific way to show that the treatments make a difference. One example of one lady in an unusual situation, but something that I think all of us agree, and I would echo the comments that were already made, is so critical to understanding, and particularly in the oncology world, what we do and how we do it, and the goal that we have to have of improving quality of life.
Thank you. Dr. Sommer?
Yeah, I'll just use another example, too. We had a new medication we're looking at. Most of the patients with rare diseases are on the medicines they take for life. So it's every day, day in, day out, and these care plans are often complex and highly, they really affect the whole family. So the new drug looked like it was promising from the standpoint of, maybe a little bit better efficacy, a little bit better control, but it was 5 times a day instead of 2 or 3 times a day compared to the old one. And the families were like, why would we add 3 more times a day of dosing for this small effect? And no one had really bothered to ask them that before we started. So I think there's all of these things that really getting the patient input early on is going to make a difference.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, can I ask one more question?
You may proceed.
Okay, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Dr. Beal, this CF Foundation's venture philanthropy model has produced incredible results. Congratulations. Your foundation found your breakthrough drug when it helped translate some of the early research through the Valley of Death, and now you have the Kaleido. Sounds similar yeah, I'm sorry. How were you able to establish this program, and how can other groups adopt a similar model?
Well, it's a willingness to take risk, and that's what you have to do in drug discovery. And we were frustrated by the fact that companies were not getting involved in the orphan diseases. So the whole concept here was to say, take some of the risk out of biotech companies or pharmaceutical companies to get engaged in CF research. And as I said, we spent $42 million initially to start a high-throughput screening that led to Kaleido. But I think what's the most important and gratifying thing for the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, I know Ms. Furlong was in my office a number of years ago, and it's the ability, and what we're seeing is so many other organizations are feeling the same impatience that our foundation felt 14 years ago, and adopting this. When the first time I talked about venture philanthropy at the bio meetings, we had 10 people in the audience. And now it's really becoming really inherent in what many voluntary health organizations are doing. In fact, Faster Cures has been an organization has had central to making some of that happen. There are law firms that specialize in it. So we love to share our ideas. We share ideas all the time, and it's been very gratifying to our community that we happen to be fortunate enough to be able to start it because we had the resources. Bill and Melinda Gates gave us $20 million to start our program. We had other dollars to really make that initial investment.
Can you tell us how you successfully established the registry?
Oh, as I say, it goes back a long time. Yeah. But, you know, Dr. Zahuni was here several years ago when he was the head of the NIH. And he says one thing about the CF community, it is a community with a culture of research. And every patient who goes to one of our care centers is asked, do you want to participate in a patient registry? And I think it's 99.5% of the patients that say, yes, I do, and then find a formed consent. So it's all part of the culture. It's part of the culture the organization creates. It's the physicians, and it's the relationships, and the recognition that it's an important part of having a disease because we can't cure this disease without their involvement.
Very good. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks to the gentleman. Dr. Sommer, I didn't get to you in my round. On Wednesday, we heard an idea thrown out there. You know, there are vast amounts of data available that are not being utilized. And we all know what an organ donor is. The idea was that we have data donors. Now, how would this play in? You mentioned the IRB system, de-risking the process. What's your reaction to that?
This is something we talk about when we're having coffee a lot. There are data sets all over the place. In fact, most of them end up usually lost when someone's computer gets recycled. We had a physician lose 15 years of data because his Excel spreadsheet didn't update. I think find a way that balances, obviously, people's desire for confidentiality versus the irreplaceable and oftentimes irreproducible amounts of data that are out there. We really do need to find that balance. My reaction to that would be I'd love to find a way forward with that. That one's you can see a lot of sides to that question, but I definitely think it's worth looking at. And I think what we find is a lot of patients are like, yeah, I'll put it out there. I'm fine with that. There will be a small core that won't. You take account for that. But I think most folks, if you ask them, saying, would you feel okay if your data's out there so everybody can take a look at it, would be fine. You see people opening up their genomes who had their genome sequence saying, I'll publicly post it along with my medical health history. A lot of folks want to help.
I did that.
Thank you. Thank you.
23andMe. I mean, that is a real thing that's happening right now. And yeah, privacy is something we all value, but it also the voluntary relinquishing of a portion of that to the greater good. I think that's something we ought to encourage. Well, not encourage, but we certainly shouldn't stand in the way if that's an
Correct.
activity. And unfortunately, I can't say that we don't always respect that we shouldn't stand in the way. But enough about that.
All right. Chair, thanks to gentlemen. That concludes the questions. The members are here. Another exciting, informative, very important hearing. Thank you so much for coming. Now, members will have follow-up questions, and we'll send those to you. We ask that you please respond promptly. I remind members they have 10 business days to submit questions for the record, and that means members should submit their questions by the close of business on Friday, July 25th. I have a UC request, a statement for the record from the National Health Council. Without objection, that will be inserted into the record. Without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned.